on a full moon night, where snow blanketed every road and tree, and the howling wind carried a biting chill, a young girl ran for her life. "Baby, my dear daughter, you must live long," she thought. The little girl ran hard and long, seemingly near exhaustion, each step growing heavier. Then, she found a hiding spot behind a tree. Just behind her, an indescribable cacophony approached, the sound of many footsteps closing in. A group of men armed with swords and knives rushed in. "Find her, we must find that girl." They seemed incredibly hurried, as if something terrible had happened. She tried to escape them at all costs. "By the life of my poor younger brother, by the life of my dead father," she thought. Her feet were now covered in scratches, and she didn't know how long she had been running, now for her very life. "So, no matter what, I must live." She continued to run until she felt safe in the distance, until she no longer heard the commotion behind her. The sun finally began to rise, and, exhausted, she stopped by a large tree, gasping for breath. Suddenly, a horse neighed in front of her, and a man on horseback approached. He suddenly spotted a woman with scratches on her hands and feet, with beautiful black hair. She noticed him too, and looked at him, seemingly startled. He was surprised as well. "Oh my God, oh my God." The tall, strong man on horseback stopped, his face kind. "I thought I'd met a forest god," he said. He dismounted and took off his fur coat. "Ha ha, but even a forest god would freeze to death in this cold weather." As he removed his coat, the girl immediately took a few steps back. "Are you all right?" he asked uncertainly. Suspicion and fear were evident on the girl's face. She seemed afraid of strangers, or perhaps she had just experienced something unfortunate. Her eyes were filled with wariness. Understanding this, he stood at a distance. "I won't come any closer, so don't be afraid." He offered her the coat. "It's cold, so wrap this around you first." The girl remained silent, neither taking the coat nor running away. Seeing this, he said, "A damp morning in the forest. Oh dear." He seemed concerned for the child. "It's better not to die, but you seem to not know what suffering is." The girl still stood there, in her thin, tattered clothes, her breath clouding the air, not taking the warm fur coat. He seemed to understand the child's psychology and offered comforting words. "Even if you run away, I won't chase you." Finally, as the cold was biting, the girl, seemingly feeling it too, reached out and took the fur coat. "Judging by your appearance, you seem to have come from afar," he asked. He also introduced himself. "This is my land, and my name is Drewberg, Lord of Orink." He tried to be more friendly. "What should I call you?" The girl remained silent, only he kept talking. "Do you not have a name?" "Oh my, if you're not mute, perhaps you haven't learned the language here yet." The girl finally spoke. "Deon," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "My name is Deon." Wrapped in his large fur coat, she seemed to have gained a little trust in him. In another, warmer place, free of snow, early in the morning, a soldier's camp stood meticulously arranged. A white-haired man sighed. Another party. He seemed bothered by his own popularity. He held invitations in his hand, invitations to many parties for the sake of friendship. "Everyone is eager to make me their son-in-law." I mean, these friendly gestures come with countless reasons. He was contemplating what to do with the pile when his servant emerged from the tent. But as you know, everyone is ambitious for the title. A 28-year-old single man, a member of a prestigious family, who earned the title of Lord at the age of 12. Even the king granted you the title of Gwen, meaning beautiful. He sighed, though not impressed. Marriage is just a political strategy used to solidify one's parents' finances and status. Love didn't seem to matter in his eyes. The servant held out a notebook. "If you find someone with the best status and assets tomorrow, the Lord's wife will surely be a princess. Every Lord's daughter is eligible. The Lord will choose the one with the best qualifications from among them." He listened to his servant's words, bored and speechless, finally glancing at him. "I've avoided marriage until now. Who knows, somewhere in this world, there might be a woman who will drive me unconditionally mad, and that woman will change my destiny." The servant behind him was at a loss for words, not expecting this side of him. He too was surprised. This playboy was finally giving up his games. So many women had clung to him, and now he was determined to find his true love. But he still didn't understand why. "What are you talking about?" He feigned indifference, his mind already made up. "It's hard to change," the servant said, looking at him knowingly. "There won't be such a girl." The servant knew his master's desires all too well. He wanted him to marry the most eligible princess as soon as possible. He smiled confidently, gazing at the large castle before him. "Regardless, this is why I shouldn't have rushed here as soon as I heard the news of Count Drewberg's death from old age." He was referring to the lord of this region, the one who had saved that little girl in the freezing snow, a few years ago. The soldiers' weapons and equipment, from swords to axes, were neatly arranged on racks. The sun had risen higher above the tents. He turned and walked away. The servant, seeing his face, was taken aback. Your expression and aura seem cheerful. He remained silent, gripping his sword tightly as he slid down the foot of the hill. Yes, cheerful indeed. If the expedition is too easy, it's like drinking watered-down wine. A ruler as powerful as a hyena often bears their fangs too easily. Small-scale wars are breaking out little by little from all sides. The royal family is gradually being forced to accept this situation, letting them fight amongst themselves and exhaust their strength before the wars become too intense. The noble's power is so great that it threatens the royal authority. However, ignoring the small-scale wars has resulted in the depletion of the noble's strength. The side effect of this is that the king's name becomes less known. In the end, to consolidate royal power and suppress the noble's authority, the king has to shoulder his burden. As a result, tensions are rising throughout the country, ready to explode at any moment. The late Count Truberg's small estate, Orlan, has also fallen into this trend, while I am enjoying this distant peace. The Count's castle is not advantageous in defending against foreign invasions, nor does it have a large number of soldiers. Only the people within the territory are cooperating to prevent foreign invasions, the servant said. You shouldn't care about them. After all, this is just a war for the nobles to divert attention from the true strength of our army. Remember the days of conquering small castles like Orlan. Rumors will spread throughout the kingdom that Exer's army is nothing special, quite shabby. He took note of the servant's words. So the current situation is not bad. After all, that's the goal, he said. Not bad, but not good either. First of all, isn't the other side's spirit too strong? They say Druberg chose his own path, but it wasn't worth risking his life for. The servant gestured to a soldier. Bring that here. Even so, we should have received a reply. It was an arrow with a letter attached, seemingly shot from within the castle. As he unfolded the letter, he said, "This is a reply to the threat we sent yesterday, asking why so many people don't want to be annihilated." The letter began, "I cannot open that door for those who do not manage it." They seemed determined not to open the gate, resolved to resist. But what he noticed even more was the handwriting. Such beautiful handwriting. Was it written by a woman? It also implied, "I cannot surrender to those who invade for the sake of expanding their territory." He sat down on a wooden crate, trying to finish reading the reply. "Truly, for me, this war is but a jest. My goal is to prevent my ulterior motives from being attributed to the royal family or other nobles. A good goal, correcting other nobles while advancing towards his own objective." This was Orink. He found it amusing, a woman speaking of rules while a knife was held to her throat. It piqued his interest in the author of the letter. "I've met countless women," he mused, crumpling the parchment in his hand, a flicker of excitement in his eyes, "but never one like this." A smile played on his lips, the smile of a powerful man who sensed destiny at play. What kind of woman is she? He wondered aloud. The same little girl Count Druberg rescued from the biting cold all those years ago. Now she's grown, and Druberg is gone. She no longer has a loving haven to rely on. His gaze drifted towards the tents being erected, a reflection of the uncertainty and apprehension clouding her future. His servant, however, saw something more suspicious. "Perhaps," he ventured, "it's a spy's report." The blonde servant looked startled. "A spy's report?" The servant elaborated. It said there are numerous protests within the castle walls. Both men turned their gaze towards the distant fortress. "They haven't engaged us in battle," the white-haired lord observed, "but they're huddled inside like turtles in their shells." "Did old Druberg only have 2 sons?" he inquired. The servant answered without hesitation. "Yes, he was a very kind old man, often needing a cane to walk in his later years. And then there's Alvin. The elder son is timid," he continued, "born to the younger, second wife. Then, when Druberg passed, the second wife immediately seized power." He began to feel perplexed. Things are rather complicated here. But such vehement protests aren't the doing of his second wife, are they? The servant closed his notebook. "According to the spy's reports from the first day, there's talk of surrender. Even the Hukio faction insists on opening the gates before our offensive intensifies." Hearing this, he burst into laughter. "Then it's highly likely that inside the castle, your people He smiled confidently, victory seemingly within his grasp. The more he heard, the more intriguing it became. Then his servant added, "It said that Count Drewberg's deceased slave is now with Alvin." Intrigued, he questioned, "A slave? This sounds interesting." The servant promptly replied, "Yes, a female slave. According to the law, a slave cannot be a lover or concubine, merely a slave with unremovable shackles on her hands and feet. But it's understood she was considered the late Count's official concubine." This rumor arose because she was seen being very close to the Count, and more importantly, she's a very clever girl. He tried to piece things together. The letter in my hand, was it written by her? Looking at it, he suddenly felt uneasy. Perhaps it's that girl pulling the strings behind Alvin. This is undoubtedly a slave's handwriting. It's her. She's the one confronting me. He seemed deeply impressed. Certain that the letter writer was a girl, and a slave at that, he mused, "I once heard that Count Drewberg picked up a foreign girl from the forest and raised her for 7 years. The rumor of her beauty piqued his interest. If everyone says so, then meeting her might not be a disappointment. In any case, it's just a rumor. I'm trying to recall her name. It was Deon, wasn't it?" His servant sighed at his casual conjecture. "Please don't mix up people's names. He's certainly talking about the slave who was attached to her father and now to the son." The more he spoke, the more he seemed to deduce. "I can't stand this guy," the servant thought, watching his lord's ludicrous expression. "Everything is calculated. I'm a foreigner, so I'm not sure of her age, but she's probably in her early 20s now. What a perfect age for a woman. According to the spy's report, she possesses a peculiar, captivating beauty that makes it impossible to look away." The more he heard, the more childish the young lord appeared. "And based on this, you insist on meeting her?" "Of course, I must meet this girl, sir. But your objective hasn't changed. If you want that, you must take the castle." His subordinate was speechless. It was like saying he wanted to risk his life just to meet a girl. "I apologize, but it won't be that easy." Silence fell between them. He waited for his subordinate's counsel, choosing to remain silent. His subordinates reported that though completely isolated, cut off from any outside information, they claimed they could hold out for another month. He smiled smugly. "Who said that? That slave girl?" "Yes. The first reason is that winter will arrive earlier this year. The second is that a third of Exus's territory, the Duchy of Galion, borders the sea, and the army is retreating. But that's no easy feat. They'll take advantage of the situation. Those pirates will land and plunder." "Indeed. The third reason is..." His subordinate abruptly stopped, shaking his head. "Never mind. Continue." "The day Count Drewberg died, a soldier immediately delivered a petition. They said it was hidden on the road to the royal palace. 'If you see invaders, flee at once. Do not look back. Her plan is more thorough than I thought.' Oh, how audacious. It makes me even more curious about her." The more he spoke, the more intrigued he became. If her uncle is mentioned, the king will quickly intervene and mediate. We just hope the king doesn't interfere in that matter. He's only concerned with seeing that woman now. He said if they reconcile, I'll never see that slave girl's face again. Either way, perhaps the second wife and those lovers will fight amongst themselves, right? "Yes, my lord. If it weren't for Alvin, she would have been beheaded the day Drewberg died, because she's a slave." He still couldn't understand what he was thinking from beginning to end. Every time she was mentioned, he smiled. The subordinate continued. "Dealing with the second wife is now more urgent than the war itself. This seems like the perfect opportunity to meet that slave girl. Tell Drewberg's second wife I want to send a lavish gift. A beautiful woman, locked away in a castle for so long, unable to enjoy lavish parties, must be quite depressed. He seems to want to liberate that slave girl. I want to soothe her spirits, so tell her it's a special gift from me. Jewels, perhaps, or something else. Perhaps a scarf. But she's a widow. Giving her hope isn't good." But he had already decided what to give her. Exus of Galion isn't here to invade, but to protect the second wife and her son from other lords who want to seize Orlan. The Lord of Exus seems benevolent, but he also confessed, "I really don't want to get involved in this at all." But he suddenly looked into the distance, his gaze lowered. "This was my promise to Drewberg before he died. Why be dragged into this so miserably? Wouldn't it be better to open the gates decently than to fight each other? I am Exus Marquez, Grand Duke of Galion, the greatest ruler on the continent, and notoriously amorous. I mean, tell her, does she dare pack her bags? Relay that I wish to dance with Orlan's most beautiful widow." He flaunted his natural handsomeness. "Do you understand what I mean? You mean to go directly to see that slave tomorrow, right? I've been with you for so long, but but you still can't change your promiscuous habits. Why ask such an obvious question? His mouth muttered under his breath, but his face was filled with excitement. Send the letter immediately. Prepare the carriage and gifts for the morning. Suddenly, his confidant sighed at his incorrigible philandering, but Exer, seeing it, mistook it for disapproval of his actions. They suddenly locked eyes in a tense stare. The subordinate didn't know what to do. He knew his master too well. Was I sighing in pity for myself? But Exer was only creating that tension for fun. Oh my, the subordinate still holds to his opinion. Right, so I won't do that. Exer's smile vanished. You should take this seriously. Regardless, you should start preparing. Yes. He patted his subordinate's chest. Just as I entrust this inconsequential noble task to you, I will go around the castle to find that slave girl. So you must undertake the task of persuading Druberg's second wife to open the gates. It was indeed a lofty task. They began to meticulously plan, disguising themselves as guards for a food supply cart. As expected, the gates opened for them, and they filed in, neatly arrayed. Damn, this is madness, Orenk muttered, shaking his head. Even knowing the risks, those two fools went through with it. Insane. Entering enemy territory without weapons is dangerous, but this place, it's eerily quiet. He watched as the supply carts rolled forward, his men pushing them in unison. Orenk's servant scanned their surroundings, his eyes sharp and alert. Once satisfied, he turned to Orenk. My lord, you must be cautious. If they discover you here, things could quickly spiral out of control. Orenk raised an eyebrow. Worried I'll die. The servant shook his head. Not that, my lord, but the shame of capture. I couldn't bear it. The servant's words seemed to be misinterpreted. You'd rather die than be taken prisoner? Orenk asked, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Suddenly, as he stepped aside, he stumbled against one of the car horses. The servant, witnessing his lord's clumsiness, gasped. Oh my gods! The servant breathed, relieved. It seems no one noticed. Just sounded like a restless horse. Orenk, regaining his composure, began to scan the area, his gaze sweeping left and right, searching. Though they had never met, he hoped to recognize Deon by her reputed beauty. Suddenly, something caught his eye. A strange pull, a sense of recognition. There she was. Deon, the slave, as captivating as the rumor suggested. Her hair shimmered in the sunlight, her attention focused elsewhere, oblivious to his gaze. She seemed to notice him then, this soldier who had entered the castle with the supplies, now standing apart from the others. At first, he hadn't recognized her, but as he looked closer, her beauty, even from a distance, was undeniable. Just the sight of her left him speechless, a mixture of surprise and excitement evident in his eyes. He could barely tear his gaze away. With a chuckle, Orenk removed the helmet that concealed his face. He had found her. His servant, noticing his lord staring intently in one direction, wondered which girl had captured Orenk's attention this time. He followed Orenk's gaze. Even he was taken aback. She truly was stunning. But seeing Orenk remove his helmet, the servant knew his lord's impulsive nature and immediately cautioned, Not now, my lord. He looked at Orenk, his expression serious, seemingly more concerned for his lord's safety than Orenk himself. In fact, the other soldier beside them, also in Orenk's service, a tall, imposing figure, was watching closely, ready to intervene should Orenk do anything foolish. Orenk didn't reply, simply patted his chest confidently, as if to say, Leave it to me. The servant was exasperated. They needed to return. The horn would sound again soon, and they couldn't miss it. Orenk, amused by his servant's worried fussing, let out a laugh. Relax. The servant was speechless at his lord's playful demeanor. No matter what happens, Orenk declared, you're the most reliable man in a crisis. It seemed Orenk was about to do something reckless again. The reliable servant sighed and covered his face with his hand. The tall guard beside him suddenly began scratching himself incessantly. The servant, perplexed, wondered why. If it itches, you scratch, the guard mumbled. The three continued forward, Orenk's gaze fixed on Deon as she spoke with nearby soldiers, then turned to leave. He watched, curious about her destination. An idea sparked in his mind, a way to follow her. A soldier wanting to break from formation in this place? Perfect, he thought. He immediately doubled over, clutching his stomach, feigning pain. Oh, God's my stomach. It's been killing me since earlier. He groaned dramatically, putting on a convincing performance. I need to use the privy. Be right back. This charade, of course, was meant to deceive his two ever-attentive servants, who always thwarted his attempts to slip away unnoticed. Watching Orink rush off, the servant was exasperated, cursing his lord's impulsiveness under his breath. "What are you doing now?" he muttered, apologizing to the rest of the formation. "Forgive me, urgent business." The tall guard's thoughts were even more peculiar. Using another castle's privy, he grumbled. "Honestly, it's disgraceful. Truly disgraceful." He seemed to miss the point entirely. Orink slipped into a nearby alleyway. He observed a group of drunken men. Same everywhere, he thought. Alcohol always gives me a headache. But his mind was elsewhere. A war brewing, an enemy at the gates. Yet inside the castle, such tranquility. Their continued laughter and chatter grated on Orink's nerves. The Drewberg soldiers truly were living peaceful lives. The deeper he ventured into the castle, the more profound the tranquility became, until he reached the very spot where he'd seen the girl before. His gaze swept the area, searching for the captivating woman. He scrutinized every detail, noting only the guards on patrol, vigilant for any disturbance. No matter how long he looked, he couldn't discern where she had gone. Another soldier now stood where she had been. The memory of their brief encounter surfaced. It seemed only he had been marked by it. A pang of regret struck him. He had yearned to see her, and now that she was gone, a wave of disappointment washed over him. He decided to leave. The atmosphere here was peaceful and lively, a stark contrast to the heavy, somber mood of the war raging outside. He decided to wander a little longer before returning to his carriage. As he walked, snippets of gossip reached his ears. "Ah, that poor slave girl. She was just by the well a moment ago." Suddenly, the first horn blared. Orink's servant, Axel, also startled at the unexpected sound. "Only one horn blast left, my lord," the tall guard called from behind. He should abandon this hopeless search within the vast castle. It was time to return. He sighed, a mixture of complaint and annoyance. These nightly excursions are pointless. Removing his helmet, he spoke clearly. "Everyone puts Zeph's orders before mine." The tall guard chuckled amongst the others. "Zeph is the one who loves you, my lord." His impatience growing, he tossed his helmet to the guard, muttering, "I'm thirsty." The guard called for Zell, but Orink had already decided to leave. It seemed he would abandon this plan after all. Yet, a renewed determination to find her surged within him. The harder she was to find, the more he craved her presence. "I must find her." He began to weave through the streets. "I must find her, no matter the cost." What kind of woman is she? He wondered. Suddenly, he stopped, his eyes catching something familiar on the other side of the well. A girl sat there, captivating his attention. And then, his heart bloomed like a rose. "I couldn't find her when I searched, but when I resolved to find her, she appears." Truly, resolve is everything. The place was tranquil and serene, but upon seeing her, the entire space seemed to transform into something romantic. Was it her beauty, or were the rumors already weaving their magic on his heart? Deon remained seated, gazing into the distance, her expression tinged with melancholy and sorrow. The death of Count Drewberg seemed to weigh heavily upon her. Suddenly, she, too, turned towards Exer Marquez. Their eyes met. She might have felt nothing, but the Duke, who had longed for this moment, felt a thrill course through him, his eyes lighting up. Is this a destined encounter? Just the sight of her warms me. He couldn't shake the thought. This girl, I want her. Yes, his resolve hardened. He vowed, I will have her. I must. After sitting for so long, Deon, stiff from the cold, stood up. Exer, startled by her movement, approached her. Standing before Deon, who had no idea who he was or what he wanted, he towered over her, a cryptic smile playing on his lips. What is this warm atmosphere? She wondered. She looked at him, he looked at her, and the air grew thick with unspoken tension. He chuckled softly, his action still a mystery to her. He tried to appear intimidating, yet a note of admiration laced his words. You're not afraid, even surrounded like this. Deon, seemingly unconcerned whether he was an enemy or not, averted her gaze. You should hurry back when the horn blows. Indeed, this man, a conqueror of countless women, lifted her chin. Such a melodious voice, how alluring. but he stopped abruptly, raising a hand and smiling. I'm parched. A dipper of water would be a great help. Her demeanor suggested she found him bothersome. With a sigh, she said nothing, turning to draw a dipper of water from the well she had just been sitting by, offering it to him. She offered him the brimming bucket. Exus reached for it, but his thirst wasn't for water. His gaze, intense and unwavering, fixed on Deon. In a swift motion, he pulled her hand towards him. Deon startled, her normally vacant, melancholic eyes widening with shock and alarm at the soldier's boldness. He was brazen, this stranger who, without a word exchanged, dared to touch her. The bucket tumbled from her grasp, water splashing across the ground. Before Deon could comprehend what was happening, Exus claimed her lips with a desperate kiss. Perhaps the chaos of the situation had stripped him of his usual composure. Exus held her fast, the kiss deepening, unrelenting. Deon pushed against him, but he refused to release her. Even the most fervent kiss must eventually end. He broke away, but his arms remained around her, reluctant to let go. Deon's face remained an impassive mask, betraying neither embarrassment nor anger. One of Exus's guard addressed them. "My lady, you must leave now." Held in the embrace of this soldier who stared at her so intently, Deon's composure remained unshaken. He reached out to caress her cheek, but she shied away, replying, "Yes, I will go now, Sir Exus." Exus, seemingly pleased with himself, a triumphant grin spreading across his face, declared, "Thank you for such sweet water, my lady." He recognized the recklessness of his actions, a departure from his usual controlled demeanor. He was a man of impulse. "Next time," he continued, "I will savor it more deeply." He had already crossed the line. Further words would only be crass. Deon said nothing, slipping past him like a phantom. She retrieved the fallen bucket and, without a backward glance, departed. Her silent retreat left Exus unsettled. I thought she would slap me." Her unexpected reaction only piqued his interest further. He watched her go until she vanished from sight. Exus finally turned back towards his men, who were preparing to depart. His business concluded, he joined them, closing his eyes in thought, then nodding. "So, in conclusion, she left without slapping me." Seemed she was rather pleased. He ducked his head, a low chuckle escaping his lips. Zephyr, who had been observing the Duke from behind, curious about his actions, called out from the gate. "The gates will open tomorrow at 4 in the afternoon." Exus wasn't surprised by the outcome, but the delay was a concern. "There's more to it than this, isn't there? What are the conditions?" Zephyr calmly replied, "Indeed, there are additional conditions. Yes, regarding this matter, the second wife also made further requests." He continued, "Baron Drewberg's eldest son, Alvin, will not be executed." Exus let out another low chuckle, having anticipated this. "Anything else?" "She requests that we acknowledge Baron Drewberg's eldest son as the heir to the family, to become the Lord of Orlon. If you accept these two conditions, they will hang a red flag in front of the barracks at sunset." Exus remained silent, offering no response as he calmly mounted his horse. Zephyr, still awaiting an answer, pressed him, "What will you do?" He removed his helmet, tossing it to Zephyr. "Hold this for me." With that, he spurred his horse forward. "We will dine in the castle tomorrow." They promptly departed from a gate. Soon, the Duke's red banner billowed in the wind. The charade of a common soldier was over. Exus Marquez, Lord of Galeon, rode on, clad in his crimson coat. The late Baron Drewberg's second wife, her son, and a handful of servants stood at the gate, awaiting the Duke's arrival. Axel, observing the strangely tranquil atmosphere of Orlon, felt a prickle of unease as he saw her. He decided to observe her closely, noting something that puzzled both him and the others: her attire. It was a morning gown, nothing unusual in itself, but why did it seem so strikingly beautiful? Was her current appearance perhaps too ostentatious? Riding closer to the late Baron Drewberg's second wife, Exus Marquez felt a prickle of unease. He couldn't understand why her gaze was so different now compared to when she was with her subordinate, Auden. "Lady Auden," he began, "it is an honor to meet you." As Exus approached, the second wife, Mary, appeared wary. Her demeanor hinted at fear, yet she maintained a semblance of decorum. "Mary Drewberry of Orlon is honored to meet Duke Gwyn Exus Marquez himself," she replied. She bowed her head. Duke Exus, still mounted, scrutinized her. "She is living proof of failure," he thought. "I still don't know what her plan is, but first, I must ease the tension, lull her into a false sense of security." He dismounted. "As I understand it," he said, stepping closer and extending a hand to the the still bowing Mary. The second wife is said to be the most beautiful woman in Orlon. She was startled, but couldn't shake her apprehension. To achieve his aims, Exer had to appear amicable. Just as they say, he complimented his tone smooth. Though worried, she placed her hand in the Duke's, unsure of his next move. He smiled pleasantly, a friendly, yet unreadable expression. After a moment, she remembered to invite him inside. He was, after all, the only one who could silence the other lords and ensure Alvin's acceptance as heir. Without hesitation, she ushered him into the castle. He followed silently, offering no reply. Inside, a lavish meal was immediately laid out. She and Exer sat side by side at the table. Accompanying the luxurious food was carefully chosen, melodious music that filled the room. The performing artists worked to enliven the atmosphere. Exer seemed pleased with the display, raising his glass with a smile, while she continually watched his every move. He felt she had some grand scheme. Even after her husband's death, she was using her son to welcome the enemy, something unheard of. If she were a clever woman, she would surely find her own way to be happy. It irritated him to see her smiling and talking like that. A discomfort settled in Exer's chest, a stark contrast to the strange comfort he had felt by the well. The musicians played their best, the music flowing, soft, and seemingly peaceful. Exer decided to continue listening to the music. The beautiful goddess of spring, she lay in the arms of the wicked Winter King, wearing his white cloak in the Winter King's kingdom. Who can truly breathe in the dark kingdom of winter? He decided to signal for the music to stop. It seemed even the peaceful sounds couldn't soothe Exer's disquiet, but the lyrics had soured his mood. He glanced coldly at the musicians. Was this song sung to mock me? This time, genuine anger flared. Madam, I thought this was a banquet to welcome me, but it seems that is not the case. She panicked. That's not. She is the goddess of spring. He repeated the lyrics, his gaze fixed on her. She clenched her jaw, annoyance flickering across her features. Perhaps she was thinking of someone. The minstrels below prostrated themselves. Oh no, Your Grace, we absolutely did not mean it that way. It's just a common song. They kowtowed repeatedly. He looked every bit the villain. The content had nothing to do with the goddess of spring overcoming the Winter King. The wine has lost its flavor, he stated coldly. Sensing Exer's displeasure, nearby soldiers rose, drawing their swords and advancing on the minstrels who had sung the careless words. To Mary's shock, everything stopped there. Sir Exer sat calmly in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. She is the goddess of spring, he murmured, his voice low. Those around him were a mixture of bewildered and afraid. Finally, Exer placed his cup on the table, a thought lingering in his mind. Before he could voice it, the second wife, Mary Drewberry, seated beside him, jumped in. Is Drewberg's slave girl truly as beautiful as spring? He asked himself, but deliberately spoke aloud. He wanted everyone in Orlon to bring her before him. I wish to see her. Is she truly as beautiful as spring? I wish to see her. He spoke casually, but in that context, it was a thinly veiled command. At his words, Mary bit her thumbnail, appearing flustered and speechless. Her attendant spoke up. Oh, that woman isn't very beautiful, Your Grace. Exer was serious about seeing Deon again. Before them, who decides? He retorted quickly, then, realizing his slip, corrected himself. I didn't mean it that way. Now Mary spoke, offering him a strained smile. Your Grace, she's the kind of ugly woman only a country bumpkin would be interested in. Why would someone of your stature be interested in that slut? Exer raised an eyebrow at the appellation, his gaze lingering on Mary. Mary, teeth clenched, amended her phrasing, forcing an excruciatingly uncomfortable smile. That child, she stammered, the words seemingly catching in her throat. She spent the night in Drewberg's bedroom. After my husband passed, she continued, her voice laced with a false uncertainty. People said they were in Alvin's room until dawn. She feigned disbelief. It's truly unbelievable, she went on. Of course, even when my husband was alive, I was close to Alvin, like that girl would go crazy. Exer remained silent, listening to her rambling, raising the cup in his hand to his lips. Mary abruptly shifted to flattery. Of course, you are a very rich man, but after all, that girl has a very strange charm that attracts men. I'm just worried, Your Grace. Might be harmed. Exus brought the cup to his lips, his expression impassive. He merely hummed softly in response, offering no opinion. Mary, her unpleasant expression firmly in place, continued her diatribe, now about Deon. She doesn't have a particularly pretty face, but after all, men, they're very curious about foreign women. But that girl, isn't she? Mary continued her excited slander of Deon, when suddenly her eyes widened. Her voice trailed off, a heavy pressure descending, silencing her. She met Exus's sharp gaze, a warning glint in his eyes that made her feel like an ant, easily crushed. Mary, as if realizing her misstep, abruptly stopped, swallowing the words she'd meant to say. Instead, she turned away, her voice dropping to a murmur. Perhaps we could call her over, but it wouldn't be very pleasant. The bustling hall fell momentarily silent. Then, it erupted in a renewed clamor, the cause a figure who had just appeared. It was a girl in simple clothes, covered in dirt and grime. She walked proudly, step by step, through the whispers of the crowd. Despite the filth, a distinctly unpleasant odor clung to her. Everyone covered their mouths, murmuring, "So smelly, so smelly." With each step, the grime clinging to her dripped onto the clean, elegant floor of the hall, fueling the criticisms around her. Disgusting. Exus found the scene thoroughly amusing. He chuckled softly. This looks like it will be interesting. Mary, in contrast, was far less amused. Her face was a mask of displeasure. Axel, observing Mary's fearful face and trembling form, silently reveled in her discomfort. I guess she was truly jealous, so she threw her into the pigsty. But Exus's amusement faded, his attention fixed on the girl standing before him. He studied her silently. This girl was Deon, wasn't she? Her proud gait and posture caught his eye, sparking his curiosity. How could a lowly slave appear so proud? And to stand before everyone in such a filthy state, it made her seem all the more daunting. Exus smiled, intrigued. What is this? And those unwavering eyes, so calm in this situation. She's not simple, as if no thorny path could deter her. The more Exus thought, the wider his smile grew. He had to admit, even in the humble slave's garb, even covered in filth, she was still beautiful. Nothing could mask her exquisite features. Mary, hearing Exus compliment Deon, couldn't help but feel a surge of annoyance. Frustrated and resentful, she turned towards him. The surrounding onlookers finally began to murmur amongst themselves. Zephyr, too, was genuinely surprised and impressed. How could that girl remain so composed in such a situation? I guess this wouldn't be an ordinary gamble, Exus mused internally, but this is truly beyond imagination. Even when dirted, a jewel doesn't lose its luster. Zephyr shook his head in exasperation. The Lord would surely pay her even more attention now, for he never overlooked anything precious. Like master, like servant, Zephyr knew his Lord well. Exus truly would miss this. Turning to Deon, who was still in her soiled clothing, Exus declared, "Tonight, as ruler, I shall embrace you." Mary, displeased by Exus's words, immediately turned to him. Not daring to be disrespectful, she merely said pointedly, "The Duke's tastes are certainly bold. I suppose it's natural to grow tired of ordinary beauties." But Exus ignored her, continuing to address the girl before him. In exchange for this entertainment, Exus continued, "I shall grant you a precious gift. What do you desire?" Deon didn't appear shocked, flustered, or surprised. Maintaining her calm and collected demeanor, she stated her wish. "I want to know what happened to Alvin." Exus fell silent, his expression darkening. Why does she ask about Alvin's whereabouts, he thought. Is this merely a polite inquiry, a pleasantry, or does she truly care for him? The playful look he'd worn earlier vanished, replaced by a frown of displeasure. He hangs alone from the castle tower, waiting to be ripped apart and eaten by crows. Do you have any other questions? This time, Deon was silent for a moment. After the pause, she spoke again, asking the second wife and her son, "Tell me, when do you plan to kill them?" At this question, Mary lost her composure. Slamming her hand on the table, she rose to her feet and shouted, "You wench!" All pretense of patience vanished. She shrieked like a fishmonger in the marketplace. "This is madness. What nonsense are you spouting?" Mary's face was completely contorted with rage. In contrast to her fury, Exus, abandoning his earlier annoyance, couldn't help but laugh. It erupted from him in a great bellow. Hearing his laughter, Mary, bewildered, turned to him. Duke Exus, continuing to ignore her, turned back to Deon. Why do you assume I will eliminate them, he asked. Deon, who had maintained an impassive, calm expression throughout, spoke. The Duke came here solely to conquer Orlan. The purpose of conquest is not direct rule, but to bring Orlan under your control. If you do not intend to rule this land personally, you will likely appoint a worthy representative. However, as you are aware, she holds no loyalty to you, and so you cannot entrust this territory to her. Exer found Deon's words highly amusing, while Mary remained in a state of mounting dread. Ignoring their reactions, Deon calmly continued. One who has betrayed once will surely betray again. Since she murdered her own stepson, the rightful heir to this land, no one will trust her again. Mary hadn't expected her to blurt everything out like this. She still attempted to argue. This girl, it wasn't me who killed Alvin. The latter half of her sentence was meant as an explanation to Exer, but Exer was in no mood to listen to her excuses. He was far more interested in the other girl. So, ignoring her, Exer continued to respond to Deon. Indeed, those who are untrustworthy and unjust cannot rule. Then Exer called out in a loud voice, "Knights, listen!" Responding to their lord's command, the knights immediately rose to their feet, hands resting on their swords. Exer gave his order. The second wife and her son, along with the high-ranking officials of Drewburg, execute them all. As soon as his words fell, the command was immediately carried out. The knights moved swiftly, and the hall became a scene of carnage. Deon, as ever, remained calm and unmoving amidst the bloody slaughter in the hall. Watching her like this, Exer found it incredibly intriguing. She hadn't even blinked. Siver approached Exer and reported, "My lord, let us begin reorganizing internal affairs. I will send a request to His Majesty to confirm the occupation. Please sign the confirmation now." But Exer's decisive response took Siver by surprise. He flatly refused. "No." Exer smiled. "Let's do it tomorrow. I believe I'll be quite busy tonight." Deon, now washed clean, wore a simple yet beautiful dress. The Drewburg servants showed her little respect, their resentment fueled by the attention Duke Exer had shown her. Whispers about her began to circulate. She killed the Lord's wife, the one she used to serve, and then declared herself free. The rumors continued to spread. Is there a more vicious bitch than her? Yeah, she's only enduring this talk because the one who cared most for her is dead. Even the young master outside. Deep down, she's more like a viper. Let's see how long her good fortune lasts. Deon didn't bother addressing them, letting them say whatever they pleased, but they intentionally spoke louder in her presence. All the men must think she has honey between her legs. They don't know that all women are the same. A servant roughly combed Deon's hair, but she continued to ignore their words, refusing to make a fuss. "Oh, my poor young master Alvin. If we had surrendered earlier, your life would have been spared. I had no choice but to listen to that bitch back then. Now I don't know what that girl intends to do to her." The servant continued to berate her to her face. "It's truly dreadful. Swords are merciless, but they're not as sharp as a person's words. Young Master Alvin, the second young master, is also dead. In truth, the Drewburg family is going to perish today. The end." That's right, that's right. The seed of the Drewburg dragon has withered. With her makeup done, Deon looked no different from a noblewoman. The servants continued their incessant chatter around her, but their fabricated words no longer held any weight. They continued to gossip. The one who attacked Orlan is the renowned Quinn Exus Machina. Perhaps he knew about this beforehand and planned to wipe out the entire family. If she were anyone else, she would have made an excuse without hesitation. They targeted her silence and attacked it. Dirty bitch. The servant viciously jabbed a hairpin into Deon's head, looking no different from the devil she spoke of. Another servant, of similar age, cautioned her, "Oh my, stop it. What if she goes and complains? This girl won't say anything. Don't you know how cunning this girl is? She keeps everything bottled up inside." Deon continued to sit and listen, saying nothing. As evening approached, twilight settled behind the castle. A servant of Orlan led the girl, presumed to be a slave, forward toward a French window, where she abruptly stopped. The sun was about to set, and her eyes held the glimmer of a distant plan. Suddenly, a voice urged her from ahead. "Hey, hurry up, let's go." Reaching the door, the man leading the way was about to push it open, oblivious to what was happening behind him. Deon, the slave girl, showed no intention of entering. Then, who had remained silent until now, seeing the door about to open, finally spoke. Turning to her guide, she said, "I would like to change my perfume." The guide was startled, not expecting her to speak, and her words sounded strange to him. Maintaining her usual calm and indifferent expression, Deon repeated more clearly, "I'd like to change to a lavender scent. Please wait a moment." The guide remained bewildered, his mind short-circuiting. He stammered, well, then immediately corrected himself. That might not be possible. Rubbing the back of his neck, he said with a slightly embarrassed and timid expression, "Because I can't leave you alone." Deon calmly replied, "You just need to lock the door." The guide, seemingly an honest man, immediately darted off, calling back over his shoulder, all right, then I'll be back soon, so please wait for me." As soon as the guide was out of sight, a key mysteriously appeared in Deon's hand. She moved swiftly and efficiently. In a flash, the window opened, revealing the first stars of twilight against the darkening sky. Deon gazed out, her eyes filled with determination. With swift, practiced movements, she knotted together strips of cloth, fashioning a makeshift rope. She lowered it carefully from the window. Securing the rope, Deon descended without hesitation. Unnoticed, her hair ornament had fallen loose at some point. Night had fallen, the moon round and bright, bathed in moonlight and starlight. The girl slipped down the rope away from the window. Her feet touched the ground. Wasting no time, she ran, fleeing the castle. It was always like this from childhood to now, always running, even when she longed for a place to settle, always ending in escape. Perhaps this was how she would live until death. The thought accompanied her as she deftly and fluidly avoided those she passed on the road. Death might be easier, she thought, but she had to live a long, long life until she became a wrinkled, hunched old woman. She had to live no matter what. It was a promise to her mother, and she would keep it. Deon turned her back on Drubur Castle. There was no solace for her there, no happiness, not a shred. At that moment, within the castle walls, fury reigned. A goblet slammed against a table, a testament to its owner's rage. A look of pure savagery contorted Exus's face as he snarled, "Escaped." She dared. The former guide trembled before Exus, stammering explanations. "It was while I was briefly away." Exus pressed a hand to his forehead. "Find her," he commanded. "Find her." The soldiers stood motionless, waiting for him to finish. But what awaited them was an explosion of fury. "Find her now. Deploy the soldiers. Search every corner. You must find that woman." Everyone scrambled to obey. Only Sipper remained in the room with Exus. "Isn't this for the best, my lord?" Sipper ventured. "She is but a woman, after all. No matter how many times you hold her in your arms, she will bring nothing but trouble." Sipper urged, "Forget her, if you do not wish to kill her." Exus looked at Sipper, a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. When objecting to a decision, you must offer a reason. Sipper continued, "As you know, she is an intelligent woman. It is highly likely she has gleaned information from us and will sell it to another party. Her escape now suggests she judged it difficult to use you to her advantage. In any case, she is a more formidable opponent than Drewberg or Alvin." Despite Cypher's continued persuasion, Exus remained firm. "Capture her." Cypher's voice rose. "My lord." Exus picked up the wine decanter, his voice cold. "Do you want me to repeat myself?" As the wine poured into the goblet, Sipper bowed his head in defeat. He could not sway Exus. Exus lifted the goblet, took a sip, and spoke slowly. "Ensure she is brought before me, as you wish." As the words left Exus's lips, the goblet in his hand shattered under the force of his grip. Shards of glass rained down upon the floor. The scene shifted. Exus sat in his chair, Sipper standing beside him. Fury etched itself upon Exus's face. What is the meaning of this? 7 years working together, and not a single person close to her? How can no one have a clue where she's gone? The last words were practically roared. The servants knelt below, trembling, begging for their lives. Sipper, watching Exus's rapidly fraying composure, sighed and addressed the cowering group. "All right, you may leave." As they scurried away in terror, Sipper heard a low voice beside him. "From the very beginning, I anticipated her escape." Exus's hand rested beneath his chin. "Then, is there any news?" Before Sipper could quite process the question, Exus stood and took his leave. What was the Duke thinking? Despite Cypher's calls of "my lord," Exus didn't look back. The sky hadn't fully darkened yet, but the moon and starlight already illuminated the heavens. Exus led a contingent of soldiers, torches blazing, into the forest. A grim determination etched itself across his features. The soldiers accompanying him even brought hounds to track Deon's scent. Each man was tirelessly devoted to the search, yet for a considerable time, they found nothing of use. She was but one woman, and these soldiers were considered a match for the king's own elite forces, as well as the soldiers trained by Garayan's Gwen Machina. Yet she was alone, just one slender woman with a graceful gait. Suddenly, Cypher's voice broke through Exus's thoughts. "My lord, the sun is setting soon. Let us return to the fortress." Exus, somewhat surprised by the passage of time, blurted out, "Has it been that long?" A sudden laugh escaped Exus's lips. Clearly she isn't a woman I'll embrace a few times and discard. She's proving that point in her own way. As they all prepared to turn back, a soldier came running from the distance, frantically shouting, "My lord! My lord, there are signs in the northeast direction of the Serval Forest." At the same moment, in the mentioned location, a confrontation was taking place. "Stop!" Reno shouted at Deon. "I don't want to hurt you." Deon, naturally, paid no heed to his words. She tumbled into a thicket of thorns, her bare feet bleeding, but the pain did nothing to quell her desperate flight. Seeing her momentarily still, Reno tried to reason with her. "Yes, stay still." Reno thought to himself, "She's so badly hurt, but why should I care?" She showed no sign of stopping, still intent on escaping. The two remained facing each other when suddenly, a commotion drew near. It was the soldiers, torches held high, searching for Deon. Was this truly her dead end? She felt the situation was truly dire. But her eyes held a different story, a clear declaration of her will to survive. Reno felt his thoughts were slow and misguided. When he met someone like her, he no longer understood what he was thinking. Deon kept her gaze fixed on the ground, as if afraid to meet anyone's eyes, like the look of a slave. Now she was the same. Reno could only say, "Give up. You can't escape." He was beginning to feel sorry for her. With a body like that, how could you possibly outrun so many soldiers? He gradually felt more concern and worry for the girl. What is she fighting for? Are her wounds all right? We need to treat those wounds quickly. But she heard nothing of what Reno said. No, she didn't care about anything. She turned and ran. Reno, too, was startled by that action. But my lord's orders, I'll catch up to her and seize her. Everyone continued the chase. It was truly intense, but also unfair. Reno was getting closer and closer to her, now only an arm's length away. He decided to reach out and grab her. He wrapped his arms around her stomach, stopping her from running any further with those legs. But Deon absolutely did not want to be caught, so she struggled with all her might. "Hey!" Seeing her excessive and desperate struggles, Reno called out. But then he felt a strange feeling for the girl. He really didn't know what he was thinking. She continued to struggle, hitting the arms that held her from behind with force, wanting to break free. Why is she trying so hard? What terrible things has she been through in the past to make her so panicked? Reno looked at her with a puzzled expression. She's screaming with her whole body. Finally, she opened her mouth, but it was a weak and frightened voice. "No, I don't like. Let me go." Deon gasped, her voice strained. "I don't like this. I don't like this." But Reno was determined to quiet her. He wasn't sure if this choice was cruel, but she needed to lose consciousness to calm down. With a swift, decisive movement, he struck the back of her neck. Deon crumpled, unconscious, her last vestiges of struggle fading away. Reno gathered her into his arms, his expression truly pitiful. He looked down at her, so pitiful, lying senseless in his embrace, completely unaware of what had transpired. He watched her, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. There was something he should do, something he wasn't sure of. But just then, the sound of approaching hooves echoed from a distance. As he held Deon, the sound of horses grew louder. Reno looked up, his heart seizing in his chest. Duke Exus sat astride his horse, watching him. Frozen, Reno remained where he stood, cradling Deon, fear gripping him as he met the Duke's gaze. The scene repeated itself, the tension thick in the air. The approaching hoofbeats, Reno's fearful gaze lifting to meet Exus's imposing figure on horseback. He stood, still holding Deon, his fear palpable. Exus said nothing, the silence amplifying the tension. He approached slowly, each step increasing the soldier's apprehension. He stopped before Reno, extending his arms to take Deon. The soldier had no choice. He couldn't defy the Duke. He relinquished the unconscious girl, and Exus gathered her into his arms, his gaze fixed on her face. Watching Exus carry Deon away, a pang of anguish pierced Reno's heart. The Duke had changed. Disappointment clouded Reno's features. Exus, noticing his subordinate's expression, felt a surge of anger, but held his tongue. That look, Exus thought, from anyone else, and I would have their throats slit. He closed his eyes briefly, reining in his temper. But he is one of my most valuable soldiers. He looked directly at Reno, his voice softening. Because it is you, I will pretend I didn't see it. I know what you're thinking. Reno flinched, surprised by the Duke's unexpected calmness. He had expected fury, not this unsettling tranquility. Exus turned and rode away, leaving Reno standing alone, still bowed in respect. Cypher's order echoed in Reno's mind. You must kill her. He knew now he could no longer follow those instructions. Just moments ago, before Exus arrived, he hadn't been able to bring himself to harm her. He watched Exus's retreating figure, a thoughtful expression on his face. The Duke had indeed changed since meeting Deon. Lord Sipher, he thought, I completely agree with your assessment. The Duke doesn't seem as formidable as before. Something indefinable lingered in Exus's eyes. That woman seems far too dangerous for my master. Deon, unconscious since Reno's blow, knew nothing of what had transpired. Suddenly, the flicker of candlelight pierced the darkness behind her eyelids. The memory surfaced. The wretched days alone in the iron cage, treated with such cruelty that she no longer wished to speak to anyone. Alone in the silence, in that cold cage, the sudden sound of the opening door startled her. A tall, balding man approached the cage, a white candle flickering in his hand. Have you thought it over? He asked Deon, a jovial tone belying his cruel nature. The cage, suspended from the ceiling, made her feel like a bird trap for someone's amusement. She said nothing, or rather, she couldn't be bothered to speak. His jovial facade cracked. These two love you so much, he snarled, slamming his hand on the table. Even though I'm so handsome, you still reject my love? Deon remained silent. He reached for the lever in a fit of rage and yanked it down. The cage above lurched downwards, Deon falling with it, her body hitting the floor hard. The impact was jarring. To endure such pain, such cruelty as a young girl. He looked at Deon's beautiful face and laughed, a cruel, triumphant sound. The joy on his face was unrestrained. Now, tell me, do you love me? His laughter curdled into something sickening. The extent of his lust was unfathomable. Unable to bear the barrier of the bars any longer, he pressed his face against them. Deon, still clinging to her humanity, recoiled. Such behavior couldn't be human. He was truly a beast, not a man. Absolutely not human. He clawed at the bars, his hands laden with rings, 10 in all. What a lecher. Deon, guided by a deep-seated morality, made the only choice she felt she could, though it promised to make her life even more difficult. She resolutely said nothing, utterly silent, even as he stepped outside. The click of a key sliding into the lock suggested some unspeakable purpose. The lock tumbled to the ground, a sound that sharpened Deon's need for composure. Today, he leered, I will have you. The door creaked open, the sound echoing in the confined space. He beckoned her towards him. Deon's face was a mask of cold indifference. I don't like this. I absolutely don't. But still, he advanced into the cage. Come here. He extended a hand. Reaching for her, she had no choice but to lower her head and endure to let him have his way. His hand closed around her arm. It felt like a day that would forever be etched in her memory. That five-fingered hand, heavy with gold rings, reaching for a child still so young. It was a horrifying image. Suddenly, her mother's words, which had echoed in her mind all these days, resurfaced. And in the many days that followed, after she became his plaything, bruises bloomed across her body. Back then, all she could see in her mind was a vast, empty space, a place with no end and no beginning, lost in the life of a slave. But she never forgot her mother's words. You must live. You must live for both of us. She missed her mother. The torment was so intense, she felt like she was drowning. She gasped for breath. He seemed to think it was understandable, even amusing, but her struggles were growing frantic. She truly felt like she couldn't breathe. She had to live. Her fists clenched. If she didn't act now, her will to resist would be broken forever. She lashed out, kicking him in the face, catching him completely off guard. He stumbled back, and Deon fled as if death himself were at her heels. He roared in anger, but he was helpless. She was determined to escape the life of a slave, to carry on for the sake of her poor brother's life as well. She had to run, away from these wicked people, away from that cage of despair, even if they hunted her relentlessly from the first snows until the end of the season, carrying the memory of her dead father's life. She had to run, and now she ran for her own life too. They pursued her relentlessly, trying to snare her with spears and clubs, but her will never faltered. Deep into the night, with snow clinging to the ground, the young girl pressed on, always seeking a way to escape death. No matter what, I must live. She suddenly realized she had collapsed, her long hair splayed around her. The gold-ringed hand of the master who had tormented her for so long reached towards her. She saw his sickening smile again, heard his repulsive voice. So it's you. She wanted to run again, to escape this man once more. She refused to live a life of torment. No, I don't like this. Her blank eyes suddenly flashed with a bottomless terror. I don't like this. She jolted awake, as if from a long sleep. Where am I? She was lying on a red bed, but where exactly? Suddenly, a low voice spoke from beside her. Awake at last, she startled, whipping her head around, only to be met with another shock. Duke Exus was already in the bed next to her. Was this truly appropriate behavior toward a girl he had barely met? Yet, there the tyrant lay, as if nothing were amiss. A man and a woman in the same bed. How far had their relationship progressed? Deon was stunned. They stared at each other for a long moment, neither speaking. Duke Exus rested a hand on his head, his shirt unbuttoned, revealing a glimpse of his sculpted physique. He looked at her with a puzzled expression, though the confusion seemed to belong more to Deon than to him. A sudden smile played on his lips, sending a shiver down her spine. Lying beside Deon, Exus awoke. For how long he had been watching her, she couldn't know. He finally spoke, a charming smile gracing his lips as he gazed at her with amusement. They stared at each other in a silence that could have been ripped from a romantic drama. Exus chuckled softly, while Deon's expression remained blank, as if he were a madman. Exus broke the strained quiet again, murmuring with a hint of playful mockery. Well, typical reaction. Screaming. Or perhaps you're embarrassed? Deon listened, still betraying no emotion. Exus continued. It must be one of the two, right? Deon, as usual, remained silent, her gaze fixed on the man before her. An unspoken understanding hung in the air as they continued to observe each other for a long moment. Suddenly, Exus spoke again, his voice laced with inquiry. It hurt while you were sleeping. You kept saying it hurt. His eyes searched hers. A sound like a dying bird, so faint it was barely audible, escaped her lips. Her gaze dropped abruptly to her feet, relaxing. No shackles. She sat up with a jolt, startled, as if expecting to be bound. The horror of it all seemed to hit her only now, and in such a strange way. It was this unusual reaction that further puzzled Duke Exus. He reached out and grasped her hand as she sat there. He pushed her back onto the bed, pinning her hand beneath his own in a gesture that bordered on coercive. They held each other's gaze, neither speaking. Her expression remained impassive as she stared back at Duke Exus. But that was even more of a mistake. Duke Exus reveled in the unique, the untamed. He had experienced it, and it only fueled his desire. So close to a man like him, how could she not be captivated? He tightened his grip on her hand and forced another kiss upon her. This was supposed to be the moment she would succumb, entranced. But it wasn't. She abruptly clenched her hands, a whimper escaping her lips, and with all her might, shoved him away. Duke Exus wondered, a scoff escaping him. He couldn't comprehend her feelings. She immediately slid off the bed and moved away. He seemed surprised by her actions, making no move to stop her. Deon huddled nearby, turning her head to watch him warily. Why not react this way during the first kiss, only the second? He thought she looked like a small, sulking cat. Exus rubbed his head. Oh dear, oh dear. Then, looking at Deon, he suddenly laughed, finding her captivating. She stood there, her eyes darting around the room, as if searching for something to protect herself with. Finally, her gaze landed on a knife on Duke Exus's table. She snatched it up quickly. It was a paring knife. In her haste, an apple unfortunately tumbled to the floor. Witnessing this, Duke Exus asked, "What do you intend to do with that?" She gripped the knife tightly, her hand steady, as if accustomed to holding a blade. With a sigh, Duke Exus exhaled. What was this girl planning? He said, "Come here." The difference in their size made it clear such a mundane weapon was useless, wasn't it? A rabbit, no matter how large its fangs, couldn't defeat a hound. Despite this, Deon didn't lower the knife. She even raised it in front of her. Seeing this, Exus felt a mixture of surprise and alarm. The knife, seemingly aimed at Exus, was actually the opposite. He found the girl's actions intriguing. rather amusing. The knife wasn't for self-defense, but pressed against her own throat. She intended to threaten the Duke. If he made any further aggressive moves, she would end her own life. The Duke couldn't bear the sight any longer. He stood and started towards her. He chuckled darkly. Surrender would be preferable, but Deon responded without hesitation. No, I will survive. Duke Exer found her actions increasingly at odds with her words. If that were the case, it seemed the blade had been reversed. She realized from Exer's gaze that he couldn't stop a woman desperate to live. At least I will overcome today. The smile vanished from Duke Exer's lips. He decided a more serious demeanor was required. He suspected it was a brazen provocation, but she seemed utterly earnest, possessed of a fierce determination that suggested she was capable of anything. Confronted with a girl willing to take her own life to protect her virtue, the Duke felt he should proceed with more wisdom. He reached for a nearby chair and sat down calmly. "Do you love Arwen?" he asked, his tone suggesting the rumors he'd heard from Zephyr had stirred something within him. Deon hadn't expected such a peculiar question and couldn't answer immediately. After a moment of silence, the Duke patiently repeated himself. "I asked you, do you love Arwen?" How could he ask such a thing in this situation? How was she supposed to answer? But she had to survive, so answer him she must. "I cherish him," she replied. The Duke interpreted this as the nascent stirrings of a love she hadn't yet recognized. "So you're saving yourself for him?" he inquired. To this, she boldly and unhesitatingly responded, "No, I cannot sleep with a man I do not love." At her words, the Duke couldn't help but laugh. She was the first to ever give him such an answer. He suddenly recalled his guard, Zephyr, saying, "It seems your pride has been trampled. I'd prefer you didn't say such things in front of Zephyr." A flicker of an unknown, private pain crossed his mind, and he chuckled. They'll mock me." After a moment of amusement that seemed to be solely his own, he declared, "Well then, what shall I do with you? You belong to me." The Duke had been observing Deon's every move and expression, but she showed no reaction. "Treat me as a slave. I will live and work as I do now," she suggested. The Duke found this girl increasingly perplexing. "A slave? You'd prefer to toil day and night as a slave rather than enjoy fine food, clothes, and luxurious jewels." "Yes," Deon answered without hesitation. He seemed to fall into thought for a moment. After all, she had lived as a slave for a long time. A daring idea suddenly struck him. "All right, let's play a game. You can do whatever you wish." Deon was astonished, hardly daring to believe the Duke's generosity. But this small concession came with a catch, which he quickly added. "That is, I also get to do whatever I wish." He seemed rather pleased with this impulsive plan. "Now let's decide on the rules. The simpler, the better," he said with a glint of excitement. He held up a single finger. "So just one." Deon couldn't fathom the purpose of these rules. He wasn't a child. But she knew refusing would only make things worse. "The rule." She began slowly. "What is the rule?" she asked, looking directly into his eyes. She had to survive. He chuckled softly. In the end, she would have to agree to his game. "You seem quite keen on never leaving this castle," he observed. "Of course, that's not the only condition. However, if you disappear from the castle, from my sight, then, dead or alive, I will fulfill my desires first." He seemed quite serious about this matter, as befitted a man of his power. He assumed she would naturally comply. "But I still need to hear your answer from your own lips." He asked again, "When that happens, I won't need your consent, correct?" She remained silent. What an introvert, he thought, taking her silence as agreement to his rule. "First, clean my room." In the morning, he walked over to where she stood and bent down to pick up the apple she had dropped in her alarm. As she reached for her knife, he continued, "Bring tea every night at 10. He placed the apple on the table behind where Deon stood. "Sleep here tonight." With only these few instructions, he opened the door and walked out, leaving just as abruptly as he had arrived. Deon was stunned, hardly able to believe her eyes. He had simply retreated, but she wouldn't allow herself to trust it. Every wealthy and powerful man who had owned her had never simply stopped. She couldn't believe him. She equated him entirely with all the vile men she had faced before. Was this a misunderstanding or a correct assumption? She placed the knife on the floor by her feet. She was truly shaken by the events of the day. She sat down in the corner, burying her face in her hands. The next morning, Deon smoothed out Duke Exer's red bedspread, her face devoid of emotion. The sun had already climbed to the peak of the mountains. She was dressed in what were unmistakably slave's clothes. Duke Exer, seemingly just awake, was washing his face at the room's basin. He was bare-chested, a towel wrapped loosely around his hips. His physique was striking, the visible muscles sculpted and powerful. He looked every bit the image of a perfect, beautiful man. Curiosity piqued. Deon glanced back, wanting to catch a glimpse of this paragon. Duke Exer, looking up at the mirror, noticed her movement, but said nothing. By the time their eyes met, she had already turned away. He knew she had been looking at him, but the swiftness, the almost frantic speed with which she averted her gaze, was peculiar. The atmosphere between them shifted, charged with a strange energy. A single glimpse of his flawless form had been enough to draw a stolen look from the impassive girl. Quickly, she offered him another towel, holding it out for him to dry his hands. Duke Exer was, in turn, surprised by her seamless service. He draped the towel around his neck and asked pointedly, "You seem quite adept at attending to others." Deon kept her head lowered, her silence unbroken since the previous day. Watching her, a thought crossed Duke Exer's mind. It seemed she had been a slave for a long time. Perhaps this also meant that old Drew Berg and his son, Arwen, hadn't used her for their own pleasure. His thoughts took a more optimistic turn, and then there were her eyes, fixed on his chest, refusing to meet his. This, too, was the ingrained habit of a slave. She was utterly afraid to look him in the eye, her gaze glued to the floor. I must correct this, he thought. Duke Exer suddenly reached out and tilted her chin upwards. Now, her eyes were locked on his. "Are your legs all right?" She didn't break her gaze, staring fixedly at a single point, but neither did she offer a reply. Duke Exer seemed displeased by this. Suddenly, this opportune annoyance gave him the excuse he needed to close the distance between them. He abruptly pulled her towards him. Deon gasped. They kissed again. No, it was more accurate to say that Duke Exer forced a kiss upon someone for the third time. As he held her, her legs trembled suddenly. She seemed to want to resist, but the lingering pain from yesterday rendered her legs unsteady. He finally released her lips, his voice low. "From now on, if you can make sure to answer." He trailed off, slowly loosening his grip. "Let me tell you, when I ask you something, you must answer." But he stopped mid-sentence, his arms still wrapped around her waist. "This is the rule between us. Remember it, or I'll kiss you." Despite his words, a different thought flickered through Duke Exer's mind. "If you don't remember, I'll be quite pleased." Deon finally spoke. "You said you wouldn't touch me, but who could trust a rich man?" He immediately denied it. "No, that's impossible." "Impossible. I won't go that far without your permission." He raised a hand as if to caress her cheek, his expression hardening again, becoming intimidating. "Even this is too much, isn't it?" he thought. She fell silent again, utterly at a loss for what to say to such a man. He continued, "In any case, if you're not satisfied, we can do this another way." Even so, she couldn't be sure if he wouldn't come up with something worse. She quickly refused. "No, thank you." And then, just as quickly, she left. Night fell once more over the lands of Orlan. He returned, dressed in formal attire. Zephyr, as usual, was seated at his desk, poring over ledgers. He didn't seem particularly pleased to see Duke Exer's return. "Ah, you just returned from your inspection?" He removed his cloak, draping it over a chair. "Yes, but Orlan isn't as prosperous as I'd imagined." Zephyr rose, a scroll clutched in his hand. "Indeed, and the place has no graves, nor any minerals worth mining. While the forest is vast, the streams aren't wide enough to facilitate logging." Duke Exer sank into his chair. "This land looks utterly exhausted. Invading this place was meant to test the king's reaction. But if it's this barren, was it even worth it?" Zephyr approached, handing Exer a scroll. "I just received a letter from the Deck royal family," he said. "He will come in person to celebrate the invasion of Orlan." Exer propped his feet on the table and unfurled the letter, a curious glint in his eye. "Ah, to celebrate, is it?" He read the Deck Prince's letter with a flicker of amusement. "Drew Berg," he mused. "I thought the old man was meticulous, but he's simply mediocre. Officials are corrupt in secret, and he's completely oblivious. Forget about it." He dismissed, then inquired, "When is the prince arriving?" "Early next month. He plans to stay for about a week." A cryptic look shadowed his features. "Before that, get rid of anyone who needs to be gotten rid of." Zephyr understood. "As you command, Your Grace." Suddenly, someone quietly opened the door and entered. "Your Grace." The newcomer started, startled. "Ah, is there something to report?" He handed the Deck Prince's letter back to Zephyr and accepted the report from the servant, which contained records about Deon. The more he read, the more perplexed he became, his brow furrowing with increasing concentration. Genuine astonishment twisted his face. This is all the housework she did today. It seemed to be what surprised him most. This is her entire day's work. Exer asked incredulously. Zephyr nodded in confirmation. Yes, Your Grace. Exer stared at the document in disbelief. Waking up at 3 a.m., that's preposterous. Is this woman nocturnal? When does she sleep? Zephyr replied. In short, she starts cleaning the front yard of the castle at 3:30, begins kitchen work at 4:30, and prepares breakfast for Your Grace at 5 o'clock. Then she starts washing dishes and cleaning the castle, all within 2 hours. Next is laundry and lunch preparation, followed by dishwashing again and cleaning the kitchen after dinner. In her spare time, she irons or sews in her room. People say that whenever there's a banquet, the second madam gives her extra sewing work. Exer leaned back in his chair, a touch of irritation in his voice. Is she the only one in this entire castle who works incessantly? Did Deon always work this much? Or is it because of my rules? Check again if anyone has been giving her a hard time recently. Reno spoke up. This has always been her workload. Zephyr, wanting to bury his face in his hands, asked, Then this woman, does she eat? Reno scratched his head, trying to recall. I usually see her eating at lunchtime. Just then, a knock came from the door. Exer casually placed his feet back on the table. Enter. Watching the somber Den enter with a tray, Exer thought to himself that there was no need to ask how much she ate. If she were eating and living well, she wouldn't look like this. Even as a slave, wasn't she the mistress of the old Count, Drew Berg, and the lover of his eldest son, the young Master Arwen? Worried about his temperamental second wife, he must have ignored her, even though he knew she was being mistreated. It went without saying, as foolish men believed interfering in women's affairs wasn't their duty. Meanwhile, he must have been watching from the sidelines, pretending to care for her a little when no one was around, and she mistook that for love. The thought filled Exer with a deep frustration. He tossed the work report to Zephyr and gestured for Reno to leave. As Deon poured the gleaming wine into his glass, Exer studied her silently. Just because the house was quiet didn't mean she felt any relief. If she drew a line, men would directly interfere. Then things would surely be handled properly. Because by pretending not to know, by not getting involved, wouldn't that create even more troublesome problems? Problems that only she would have to endure helplessly. Lost in thought, Exer abruptly ordered Deon sit. Zephyr was utterly shocked by the command. To allow a slave to sit, and at the same table as their master? Impossible. The word struck Zephyr like a thunderbolt. For a slave to eat at the same table as their master was a grave offense, punishable by whipping. It couldn't be. It absolutely could not be. Yet, to disobey a master's command was also a serious crime, one that could be met with hanging, with no chance of pardon. So what choice would she make? As everyone waited in tense silence, Deon finally made her decision, walking towards the chair and sitting down. Exer couldn't hide his amusement, covering his face with a hand as if to compose himself. Right, I momentarily forgot her innate boldness. A woman with nothing dares to test me. A strong woman, fighting silently. Deon sat before him now, continuing to peel the apple. Exer abruptly rose from his seat. Then, with a decisive movement, he pulled out a chair with a thud and sat at the table opposite Deon, closing the distance between them. He picked up a slice of the apple Deon had just cut and held it out to her. Open your mouth. This is how we play the game. Deon finally stopped her task and looked up at him. Exer tilted his head, a playful smile on his lips. It's amusing to watch your lips move. Your beauty is almost suffocating. At this point, Zephyr could no longer bear the blatant flirtation and cleared his throat, breaking the charged atmosphere between the two. Ahem. Deon didn't speak, but obediently opened her mouth. Exer murmured wider. Deon's lips parted further, accepting the apple slice from Exer's hand. She chewed slowly, silently. Exer smiled, satisfied. Good. He then cheerfully spread jam on a piece of bread. A delectable piece of bread, laden with jam, was ready. Predictably, it was offered directly to Deon's waiting lips. Exer performed this act with patient focus. After eating, Deon delicately wiped her lips. The gesture, however, didn't fully remove the glistening sheen. Exer stared at Deon, captivated. He then took her hand, examining it closely. Let me see your hands. Rough and calloused, a stark contrast to your alluring appearance. Yet they are small and delicate, as if they might break at any moment. If I were to squeeze them tightly. Exer spoke to her intently. From tomorrow onwards, bring 2 for me as well. I want to see those beautiful lips stained and glistening. The suggestive words were once again interrupted by Zephyr's cough. He produced several scrolls. These are your tasks, starting tomorrow morning. At this, Deon rose from her seat without a word and left without a sound, leaving the 2 remaining men with unsurprised expressions. After the door closed, Zephyr asked curiously, "Why didn't you embrace her last night?" Exer turned his head and replied, "Because then victory would have come too easily. Ease is no fun." Zephyr looked slightly exasperated. Indeed, the Sorcerer's Gate opened without any war. Wasn't that foretold in the prophecy? He sighed, continuing, "You'll grow bored soon enough, so I won't stop you from playing with her, but you should enjoy it in moderation." "I have work to do, Exer." Picking up his wineglass, Exer asked irritably, "Are you dissatisfied with something?" Zephyr frowned, voicing his thoughts. "She's a dangerous woman, so don't get too deeply involved." Exer chuckled and said to him, "Look, Zephyr." The 2 then engaged in a serious discussion. An unknown amount of time passed in the quiet room. Deon, with her usual impassive expression, looked at the box placed before her. Exer tilted his head curiously and asked her, "Why don't you like the gift?" It was an exquisite gold bracelet inlaid with jewels, something any girl would adore. Deon coldly refused Exer's gift, stating, "It's not appropriate for me to wear." Exer wasn't surprised by her reaction, chuckling to himself. "Right, I expected her to refuse immediately." Exer stood up, adjusting his clothes, and replied, "I'm the one who decides whether it's appropriate for you or not." Deon remained impassive. Exer, approaching the doorway, asked, "Aren't you coming to the party tonight?" Deon replied, "I am not." Exer closed his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Then you absolutely must." Deon listened silently as he continued, his smile fading, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "Accept it now." Deon still attempted to refuse. "There's nowhere to put it in my room." Seeing her resolve, Exer sighed. "I suppose Drew Berg or Arwen never gave their paramours gifts? Or perhaps your aim was to gain something better than jewels with him?" At this, Deon, unwilling to let the awkwardness stretch any further, lowered her head. "I accept it." Exer looked at the bracelet, a flicker of puzzlement in his eyes. A master craftsman's work, lauded by the ladies of the royal court. Yet to her, it's like a pebble on the road. She has no interest, no care for such small, luxurious trinkets. What, then, could pique her interest? Exer pondered, a slow smile spreading across his face. His plan was to reel her in, little by little, like a fish on a line. In the end, she will have to yield. There is plenty of time. The game has only just begun. The next day, Exer arrived on horseback, stopping at the gate. He turned to the subordinate who had just delivered a report, surprise evident in his voice. "What? Someone has accused Deon of hiding the second madam's ring in her room?" Zephyr, standing below, nodded firmly. "Yes, the accusation has been made. According to the other slaves, valuables have frequently gone missing. They say that whenever this happens, the missing items are found in Deon's room." By now, Exer had dismounted and was walking towards the servant. The servant recounted the events to Exer. "Today, while cleaning the second madam's room, some items were indeed missing. However, I later went to Deon's room and found the missing jewelry under her pillow." Exer's expression hardened. He turned and asked, "Does this happen often?" The maid standing beside him nodded emphatically. "They say this is the proof." The maid held out the cloth in her hand, several glittering rings nestled within its folds. Exer thought to himself, "Of course, these are the jewels the second madam was wearing, just when the city gates opened." Exer's eyes turned cold. "Summon all the servants in the castle." His subordinate nodded. "Yes, my lord." A short while later, Zephyr approached Exer to report. "I want to inquire further with the head servant, the maids, and the slaves. The situation is no different from what the other servants have said. Thefts have been frequent. They say that under these circumstances, Deon must be the culprit. By now, all the summoned servants were gathered in the hall, heads bowed before Exus. He strode through them, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd, quickly finding Deon's familiar figure at the back of the group. Exus walked briskly past and seated himself in the highest chair. "Head housekeeper," he called out. The housekeeper looked up. "Yes, my lord." Exus's voice was cold. If punishment is to be meted out, the housekeeper usually bears the greatest responsibility. How did the late Count Drew Berg handle such situations? The housekeeper replied, "Usually it was the severing of a hand or a whipping, but the Count advised me against it." Exus pressed further. "So, other things were permitted?" The housekeeper answered, "Yes, I would confine them to the chicken coop for about a week and let them starve. Perhaps that is why the slaves do not fear the law and continue to make the same mistakes." Exus remained silent, tilting his head as she continued. "So this time, I must be more strict." The other servants, hearing her words, looked up in apprehension. Exus spoke slowly, his words laced with meaning. "Refusing a priceless bracelet, one that money cannot buy, and yet you covet cheap rings worth but a few silver coins." Deon, standing below, remained silent under his pointed accusation. Exus was used to this by now, but a flicker of displeasure crossed his features. Even in this situation, she remained silent, expressionless, like a corpse laid out for burial. His expression hardening, Exus continued, "According to the law, a thief's wrists are to be cut off." The housekeeper, upon hearing this, looked more gleeful than ever. Exus quickly noticed her strange reaction. A bitter taste rose in his mouth as he watched the housekeeper seemingly revel in the servant's silent, bowed deference. No one stepped forward to help or defend Deon. Back on that night, after Deon had left the room, Zephyr had approached Exus with a worried expression. "She is a dangerous woman, my lord. You shouldn't involve yourself with her too deeply." Exus had simply offered him a calm smile, his gaze lingering on Zephyr for a moment before he tilted his head back and drained the wine from his glass. Setting the empty glass down on the table, he'd asked, "Who can work all day without rest, without falling ill, without fatigue, without complaint, without causing trouble, and not only not strive for the fruits of their labor, but also resent the work itself? What is that?" Zephyr had murmured, "Fortitude, my lord." A satisfied smile touched Exus's lips at his subordinate's quick response. "Precisely." He'd continued, "She is not a woman without feelings, merely one of great control. Such people are not usually considered dangerous." Zephyr had turned away, still vexed. "That's no different from saying this woman's very existence will endanger you, my lord." Exus had chuckled. "Consider her a stranger then. But when have I ever been in danger?" Zephyr had sighed, turning back. "Well, never. If you were in danger, you would have flown away long ago, like a moth to a flame." Exus poured himself more wine, a smile playing on his lips. "That's hardly a satisfactory affirmation, is it?" Zephyr had added, "But apartment." Exus took another sip of his wine. "A woman named Deon. I am often hated by many, and sooner or later, someone will use her as a pawn in their schemes. First, we must sweep clean and be prepared." Returning to the present situation, Exus spoke, "Deon, defend yourself." But Deon remained silent, her head bowed, her face devoid of any expression. This situation must be all too familiar to her, Exus thought. He continued, "Shall we give them a chance? Or should we just cut off their heads directly?" Watching her stand silently in the corner, Exus sighed inwardly. "Perhaps nothing I say will make a difference. Until now, no one would believe the words of a foreign slave," he mused. His expression hardening, Exus addressed Deon again. "Is it true? Do you want to die? Just one word." "No." "Just one word, no." Exus watched Deon silently. Surprisingly, she finally spoke. "No, I did not steal. Never." Her gaze met Exus's, unwavering. "I have no need for jewels, so I have no reason to covet them." Exus released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Then, with a serious expression, he extended his hand and commanded, "Come here." Deon quickly resumed her usual impassive demeanor. Her feet moved slowly towards Exus, the two of them like a scene from a romance novel, the aloof so reaching out to his downtrodden servant wife. As the distance between them closed, Exus reached for her and, caught off guard, Deon was pulled closer. She quickly found herself nestled against Exus, seated on the chair. Deon's composure faltered slightly. She was unused to such intimacy. intimacy, especially in front of so many people. Exus now looked coldly at the remaining servants. Look closely before I gouge out all your eyeballs. He tightened his hold on Deon, his declaration ringing out. This woman is my beloved. This is my castle. Therefore, everything here belongs to me. Anything she desires or steals, even holy relics, I care not. Do you all understand? If you bother me with this again, you will receive the punishment you demand. The housekeeper trembled, fear etched on her face. Exus continued, by the way, since I have you all gathered here. Deon, sitting uncomfortably on Exus's lap, brushed his hand off her shoulder. Exus ignored her, his grip tightening on her shoulder. I trust you've all been enjoying yourselves lately, from the head, maid to the slaves. Bribery, even embezzlement through tax evasion. Begin. Following the command, Reno unfurled the scroll in his hands and began to read aloud the list of offenses. Headmaid Sharon Stone received silver coins and 2 chickens from Impeton in exchange for Dane's employment as a maid within the castle, then gave silver coins to Zephyr, who gave them to Hans Temmer, the housekeeper, and waived last year's harvest tax. Housekeeper Hans Temmer, along with the head maid and the cook, have had their taxes waived every year and even received silver coins from Zephyr each. They also received donations, such as livestock and grain from the villages outside the castle for the recruitment of maids and for Thomas Muller, the cook. Thomas Muller received additional gold coins and 5 bags of flour when changing food suppliers, after which the supplier was replaced and received a corresponding refund. Jerry Waldo, due to last year's harvest tax issue, requested to entrust someone else to pay on his behalf and also did not pay the tax. Continuing to read for several minutes, Reno finished his statement. That is all. He turned to Exus with a fawning smile. This is the list of those who evaded taxes and accepted illegal bribes. Did I do well, sir? Exus chuckled softly. Let's see, what did he say just now? Then his gaze sharpened like a knife. All right, these people are usually flogged or have their wrists cut, aren't they? The servants and slaves, no longer able to maintain their composure, lowered their heads in terror, kneeling and pleading. We were wrong. Please forgive us. We were wrong. We committed a grave sin. Life is too hard. Deon took the opportunity to break free from Exus's hold and stood to the side, listening to the servants' pleas. If our wrists are cut, how can we make a living? Please give us another chance. I'm the only one in my family. I beg for your mercy, one pleaded steadfastly. I don't want to hear it, he commanded. Investigate the administrators of each village more thoroughly. Start a new census, collecting data not just by village, but by each household. From this year onwards, taxes will be levied according to the varying sizes of each household. The size of each household, Exus mused, stroking his chin. Actually, the original purpose of a census was to understand the number of men who could be used as soldiers. Regardless, it's still more useful now. Deon stood silently to the side, observing the situation. Exus waved his hand, commanding, "Now take down those names and flog them." The terrified people knelt down, begging him, "Please have mercy. Please, please. We just need to live. Save me. This won't happen again." At this moment, Deon unexpectedly spoke to Exus. No. Exus looked at her quizzically, silently waiting for her to continue. A thought suddenly struck him. I see. It wouldn't be bad to raise Dane's reputation along the way. Exus turned to her with a cold expression. I thought you didn't have a gentle, fake personality, Dan said. Count Drobrick passed away not long ago. The mistress, the young master, and the lord are all dead. Furthermore, if the maids currently working in the castle die, the people of Orlon will be unsettled by the immediate change in the chain of command. The people of Garion, including the lord, will be fearful. Deon's gaze became unusually firm as she presented her analysis to Exus. Exus also silently watched her for a moment. He gestured towards the pale-faced servants. But what if I really kill them? Deon's hand reached out like an angel's, and under the expectant gazes of everyone, she said, "Then the people will revolt." Exus glanced at her, asking, "Those who flaunt their power in the castle will be executed, and wouldn't the people be happier afterward?" Deon replied, "Orlon is a small, rural area, and most of the maids in the castle have family and friends outside the castle. Do you think what happens in the castle will just stay in the castle?" At this, Exus turned away with a disinterested expression. "It doesn't matter what happens to this land." Deon continued to speak with him. Unless you don't invade and become the Lord of Orlon, then yes. Exus watched her silently, thinking she's right. He looked at the woman who always captivated him and called out, "You, Deon." Deon, who had been earnestly defending her point, startled by his sudden call, snapped out of her complex thoughts. Exus smiled triumphantly. "Finally, I've figured out this woman's character." He asked the intriguing woman before him with a smirk, "Do you like politics?" "It's impossible. Incidentally, raising Deon's reputation wouldn't be bad either, but I didn't expect to find something even more interesting." "Do you like politics?" Deon shifted her gaze slightly at the question, but Exus recognized at a glance that her whole body seemed to be saying yes. He crossed his arms, eagerly awaiting her response. "So, what would you do if I were to execute those petty thieves?" "This woman will continue her cleanup work with her usual indifference." He glanced at the slaves who were looking at them expectantly. "If she wants to save them, then I can drag her into the vortex of this game." Exus ran a hand through his hair in exasperation. "It's too much trouble to throw all these people away, but how clean it would be to just kill them all. When dismissing someone, perhaps it's best to give them time and choices to change, to prepare for the future, right?" He stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Well then, all the men busy with long-term repairs and road construction, and the maids working at the inns built near the construction sites, will be pardoned, so be grateful for that." The slaves, as if stepping down from the guillotine, knelt down with tears streaming down their faces. "We are eternally grateful to you." Zephyr, standing to the side, spoke up. "You are truly merciful, sir." Exus coughed and replied, "When you see His Majesty, use today's events as an example and emphasize how benevolent I am. Perhaps so, though I don't believe it myself." Seeing his narcissism, Reno, standing on the other side, couldn't help but chuckle. Then, because of Exus's glare, he immediately became serious again, without a trace of smile. Exus ignored him and approached Deon. "And you?" He gently lifted her chin. "What do you enjoy doing the most?" Deon answered without hesitation. "Cooking." Exus promptly announced to everyone. "Then from today onwards, she is in charge of the kitchen. Remember, she will not do any other work besides cooking." "Understood. I will put her in sole charge of cooking." The servants below looked at the two in astonishment. Such a significant rise in status. "Oh my, a cooking slave? How can she handle the job?" Ignoring their gazes, Exus continued to question her. "Let me ask again. Now that I have cleared out the thieves, there's no one to work permanently. If it were you, what would you do?" Seeing her silence again, Exus sternly demanded an answer. Deon finally replied, "A census." A dissatisfied Exus stood with his hands on his hips. "What? Speak louder." Deon looked up at him and stated clearly, "In any case, if a census is already being conducted, why not make it more detailed?" Exus asked her with interest. "Detailed?" Deon explained to him. "As you can see, the number of men and women over 15 and children capable of physical labor, so that they can be selected and assigned work within the fortress, but paid weekly. And there will be a rule that the amount paid will be determined by the amount of work completed, regardless of how much." Exus was very satisfied with this answer and nodded with a smile. He then turned around and announced to everyone, "Very well, we'll do it this way." Deon quickly resumed her usual indifferent and silent demeanor, as if she hadn't just spoken, and as if it had nothing to do with her. However, Exus looked at her with interest. She's a woman who likes politics, so she doesn't care about jewelry or things like that. Because with power, wealth is sure to follow. He walked towards her again. "If I want to truly break this woman, I must first conquer her mind." Exus approached Deon, a smile playing on his lips. "You were the one who said you wouldn't open the gates for those who mismanaged, weren't you?" Exus recalled the resolute words she had penned in her letter. "I cannot open the castle gates for those who mismanage." When he had read the missive, Exus realized the handwriting belonged to Deon. Back in the present, he murmured in her ear, a hint of mystery in his voice. "The rule is to open the gates the next morning." Outside the castle gates, merchants bustled, transporting their goods. A few furrowed their brows, discussing the unfinished road. Zephyr, clutching a stack of documents, spoke gravely. "My lord, that road project is sure to cause problems in the future." Seeing Exus remain silent, Zephyr pressed on. "It's not too late to stop now. We can just pretend the road repairs never happened." Exus still hadn't turned to face him. With a calm expression, he strode forward. "If you're going to keep pestering me, you'd best hurry up and review the tax payments." Behind him, Zephyr called out, "My lord." Exus was forced to turn. "Having a road is convenient. Why do you keep nagging? You've seen it in foreign lands, haven't you?" Zephyr replied wearily, "Of course, but the situation here is quite different." Exus walked to the window and looked down, his voice firm. "It's the same here." Zephyr followed his gaze. "Those are our soldiers and Drober's soldiers. I presume there was a battle earlier." Before he could finish, he saw Exus turn away with an air of indifference. Zephyr hurried to catch up, continuing, "Of course, it's for easier access to Lord Garion's territory. Building more roads will make things much more convenient." Gradually falling behind Exus's brisk pace, Zephyr persisted undeterred. "But if I reveal the Lord's intentions for governance now, not only the king, but other lords will also be highly alert. If that alertness turns into a sense of crisis, we'll be in danger, you know." At this, Exus finally spoke, his voice laced with irritation. "You talk too much. Now is not the time. We must quickly complete the occupation, because ruling Orlon is extremely dangerous." Exus reached where Reno stood, whistling from above. He gestured back with his hand, signaling his subordinate to go to the barracks. Reno bowed his head in acknowledgement. Exus continued to Zephyr, "No matter what I do, it's just an amusing game. I've always lived this way. I prefer to do things my own way. So, building the roads you're worried about is, of course, a form of entertainment. Entertainment is entertainment, after all. Diplomacy is the same." Zephyr, standing opposite him, replied, "His Majesty fears you, my lord. Everyone in the kingdom fears their lord." Exus, arms crossed, listened, a thoughtful expression settling on his face. Seeing this was effective, Zephyr quickly continued, "Up until now, I've intentionally avoided increasing the number of soldiers so as not to provoke the king. If your lordship were to bring in troops—" He was interrupted mid-sentence by Exus. "Why don't we cultivate some elite soldiers among our ranks?" Zephyr, thoroughly exasperated with his lord's stubbornness, pursed his lips. "It's all because of her that my lord is so riled up." Zephyr's expression grew more cautious. He looked at Exus, still with his arms crossed, and continued, "We've gathered new information regarding Deon." Hearing this, Exus frowned. "Tell me." Zephyr answered immediately. "People are saying Deon tried to help Alvin escape." At this, Exus responded with a questioning look. "Isn't that obvious?" Zephyr replied seriously, "No, it's not obvious. The day they planned to escape was the night Earl Drober died." Hearing this, Exus's expression shifted, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. Zephyr continued, "While everyone was busy mourning, searching for mourning clothes, discussing the distribution of the inheritance, it's quite remarkable that a slave girl would have such an idea. Furthermore, she believed that the one invading Orlon was very likely Gwen Excalibur." Exus placed his hand on his chin and said with a laugh, "Oh my." Zephyr continued his report. Before the Lord's body was even cold, they were already preparing to resist the enemy invasion. At the same time, the Lord's eldest son was sent far away. She truly isn't an ordinary woman. Hearing this, Exus calmly realized something. But Alvin didn't leave. It could be because he was worried that the second wife would mistreat Deon. He's such a fool. Exus began to ponder the matter, his smile fading. He offered his own deduction. But there must be some kind of relationship between them. If it's love, then it's acceptable. Zephyr quickly added, "My lord, if we assess the strategy, plan a method to resist the enemy, it would indeed be very useful." Exus nodded in approval. Indeed, she is that kind of woman. Cold and intelligent, he sat perched on the railing, gazing at the people laboring on the other side. Zephyr, watching him, said, "First of all, she's a slave." Exus's gaze didn't shift. He asked indifferently, "So?" Zephyr replied with a serious expression, "Slaves are no different from livestock. She can't even legally become a concubine, not even worthy of being a mistress." Exus, as if speaking of someone else, asked Zephyr again, "So?" Zephyr was speechless, pursing his lips in thought. "Until now, I've always been good at following the Lord's actions. But this is unusual. It absolutely must be stopped." And so, like a persistent king, he tried again to persuade the stubborn man. "My lord, you may know that 5 months ago, the second son of Baron Wendell of Rostock was brutally executed for falling in love with a slave girl. His head still hangs at the city gates." As he spoke, Zephyr gripped the documents in his hand tightly. "My lord, you have many enemies, many. Indeed, many. And she is a woman. If not watched carefully, she will definitely run away. Moreover, she might also resent us because of Alvin's death. If this woman falls into the hands of other lords, it will be very troublesome." Kill her, my lord. Zephyr's last words were spoken with increased volume. Exus looked down at the ground. I will heed the advice of a loyal man like you. It turned out Exus's gaze had dropped because he saw Deon emerging from the storehouse. A wave of sympathy washed over him. Because of work, she doesn't have a moment's rest, does she? It seems she doesn't have a talent for idleness. Exus murmured to the person beside him. I'm still quite attached to her. Zephyr could only sigh helplessly, then continued his persuasion. My lord, if you cannot let her go, that's fine. But she is not a woman who can stay in the fortress long term. Exus's eyes still couldn't leave Deon's figure. He chuckled softly. I'll have to try and tame her, make her look only at me for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, Deon was in the dilapidated kitchen, having just finished her work and tying up her hair when she saw something outside the door. It was Exus, who had arrived unnoticed and was watching her with his arms crossed. Seeing her looking at him, he said, I should have told you not to leave the fortress. Where did you go? Deon removed the scarf from her head and explained, there was a shortage of food supplies at the road construction site, so I went to deliver food. Exus approached her with a puzzled look. Why would you do that yourself? You're stealing someone else's job, interfering with their livelihood. If you've already attained a higher position, it's best to get used to managing yourself and those beneath you. Exus scolded her sternly, while Deon, as usual, simply remained silent. After a few seconds, Deon unexpectedly replied with a single word. Who? Exus said nothing more, walking past her and then flopping down onto a straw bed in the corner of the room. He sighed, then lay back with his hands behind his head, looking utterly relaxed. Predictably, he turned to the other occupant of the room and gestured for her to approach. Deon, maintaining her usual placid expression, nonetheless obeyed, walking over and placing her hands on Exus. Exus swiftly caught her arm, pulling her down to sit astride him with a practiced ease. The look in his eyes at this moment was unclear, but much like a hunter assessing his prey. Deon's waist was suddenly embraced by his arm, and then an extremely romantic scene appeared. This burly man held Deon in his arms, burying his head in the crook of her neck. He fell into contemplation. This woman is like wine. The more you drink, the more different flavors you get, a fascinating drink that will make you lose your mind. A flicker of avarice crossed Exus's face. He greedily inhaled Deon's scent, knowing he desired to possess this woman. Thinking of this, Exus consented to hold her tightly and began other actions towards Deon. To Deon's surprise, she felt her collar being gently pulled down by the man in front of her. Then, he pushed her down completely onto the straw, pressing himself against her. Their faces were close, their gazes meeting without any evasion. Exus finally broke the silence. If you don't like it, say you don't like it. Vent your anger with your mouth. Deon, hearing this, continued to stare at him. Exus asked again, if you don't say anything, it means you don't hate it, right? So should I continue? Deon still didn't speak, just stared at him. Exus also silently assessed her. This woman, when I keep my distance, at least I can talk to her. But as long as I take one step closer, the conversation disappears instantly. As a slave, this is undoubtedly the best defense. Protecting herself by not speaking or telling stories to anyone, that's her way. At the same time, it means she won't be hurt under any circumstances. At the same time, this makes it impossible for me to get close to this woman's heart. After thinking for a while, Exus reached out and pulled down his cloak. Then, he covered Deon with it, asking her in surprise, do you know how to play chess? Deon softly replied, a little. So, Exus softly suggested, when you bring me drinks in the evening, let's play a game of chess. Deon immediately said, if I win. Exus interrupted her with a laugh. If you win, I will respect your opinion as long as it's within limits. How about that? Deon didn't agree immediately, but calmly clarified with him first, how much is within limits? Exus replied with a provocative smile. For example, freedom. Deon said to Exus with a blank expression, I don't need freedom. Exus leaned closer to her face and asked in confusion, don't need it? Deon said something very bitter. A slave is a slave after all. As long as safety is guaranteed, I will stay here. Her words surprised Exus somewhat. Looking at the woman wearing his cloak, he felt strange. She chose guaranteed safety over vague freedom. Very realistic, isn't it? Well, of course, if she had status and power, being a charming slave would be much better. No matter her status, men wouldn't let her go. This might be one of the reasons why her eyes were so empty, a look that felt like everything was irrelevant to her. They weren't worth her attention. Exus thought to himself, could it be that she has lost her true feelings? Thinking of this, Exus couldn't help but gently kiss Deon's forehead. Deon's eyes widened. She was very surprised. Exus didn't explain the kiss, just smiled at her. Deon slowly said, what do you want? Tell me. This time, Exus looked thoughtful, touching his chin. What do I want? What do I want? He quickly thought of an idea. Well, give me a kiss coupon, so I can kiss you anytime. Of course, you can do the same at any time, that is, when the other party loses. He reached out and gently stroked her hair. Deon unexpectedly made a decision. I'll play this game. Exus smiled with interest. Oh, how delightful. Deon continued. However, if you don't use the kiss coupon, please don't touch my body. At this moment, Exus, feeling as though he were in paradise, asked with a delighted laugh, do you hate me? Deon, bearing her true feelings, replied, I don't like you. Exus, still smiling, corrected her. All right then, the game starts tonight. Several hours passed, and outside, darkness had fallen completely. Inside Exus's room, the first game was underway, and unsurprisingly, he was the victor. He whistled, writing kiss coupon on a piece of paper. Deon, sitting opposite him, pointed out, I think you used the wrong word. Where? Erase that vulgar word at the end and change it to kiss. Exus said, clicking his tongue in annoyance at being caught, but nonetheless, he put down his pen and made the correction. Then, he handed her the paper and pen. Now sign here. Exus propped his chin on his hand, watching the woman before him, thinking, literacy is a privilege enjoyed only by royalty or members of noble families. How could a mere slave know how to read and write? If reported, this would be a serious crime, punishable by hanging. Yet, her delicate handwriting captivated him. She couldn't possibly be unaware of the gravity of this offense, yet she displayed it before him without hesitation. She truly knew how to enjoy the game. She was a natural seductress, knowing how to provoke a man. After Deon successfully signed, Exus impatiently asked, can I use this coupon now? He took the opportunity to stand and move closer to her. Drawing ever nearer, Exus gently and naturally wrapped his arm around the back of Deon's neck, and under the cloak of the endless night, they shared a deep kiss. A while later, Exus emerged from his bath, and upon hearing his subordinate's report, furrowed his brow. What? Disappeared? His gaze was sharp as he looked at the other person. The maid standing at the door lowered her head and said, I heard she was preparing potato soup for tomorrow's breakfast. So I prepared everything in advance as she requested, and then went to ask her if the food reserves were sufficient. Exus, his brow still furrowed, asked again, and then she vanished? The maid nodded. Yes, my lord. I tried to wait for her return, but there seemed to be no indication that she would come back. Exus silently looked outside, his brow furrowed in thought. It was almost 10 at night. Few people stayed up this late. Could it be because of that kiss that she ran away again? Probably not, as she wasn't that foolish. So why? Exus was extremely curious about the reason. Just then, the servant spoke again. She sometimes disappears late at night. Exus immediately asked, sometimes? The maid replied in a slightly trembling voice, about 3 or 4 times a week. People often say she's the night owl among the servants. There are even rumors that she's the pillar supporting the previous lord, unbeknownst to him. There are also rumors that she's spying for another lord. Exus's gaze turned icy. Where did these rumors come from? The maid shook her head. I don't know that, but when she returns, she's always flushed, her hair disheveled, and her clothes soaked. Perhaps it's because of how she looks when she comes back. Because people say she looks like a woman who's just rolled around in the grass. The maid realized that the more she spoke, the uglier Exus's expression became. Just a while ago, after Exus asked Deon, can I use this coupon now? The two had shared a romantic kiss. Their eyes met, lips slightly parted, but suddenly, Exus gripped her wrist tightly and pulled her away. Deon looked bewildered as he wrapped his arm around her waist, and with a look of surprise in her eyes, she was pushed onto the table. Exus leaned in close again, the chessboard they had been using clattering to the floor from the movement. He placed his hands on either side of Deon's shoulders, his face close to hers, closing the distance between them. Apparently not satisfied with the previous kiss, he commanded Deon, open your mouth. He gently traced his fingers over her lips, asking, you're not thinking about those childish kisses, are you? Are you? If you don't like kissing, we we can sleep together. Faced with Exus's proposition, Deon finally spoke. Exus heard Deon continue, explaining that the kiss, from the moment his lips touched hers to when they parted, would only happen once. A flicker of surprise crossed his features, quickly replaced by a smile. Intriguing, he replied, his voice laced with amusement. Very well. And so they began again. Deon's hand rested in Exus's, and this time she closed her eyes, allowing herself a brief moment to savor the kiss. Exus's thumb began to caress her palm, a subtle movement that Deon instantly registered. She recoiled, pulling her hand away. Turning her face away, a blush creeping up her neck, she avoided his gaze. Hesitantly, she murmured the kiss. Just one kiss, she reiterated, the flush deepening as she pushed away his hand resting on her. Exus, schooling his expression, reminded himself internally, right, let's end it here for today. The door clicked shut with a decisive snap. Exus stared after her, a touch bewildered, then slowly brought his fingers to his lips, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. This, he muttered, this is a problem. Crimson wine flowed from the bottle, filling his glass. He sought solace, or perhaps a distraction, in the potent liquid. Only by losing this battle, he mused, can I lower her guard. He took a long draught of the wine, a glint of competitive fire in his eyes. But even if I die, he thought, a stubborn resolve hardening his features, I refuse to lose. The moon climbed higher in the sky. The maid's earlier words echoed in his mind. People say they only ever see her returning at the break of dawn, her face flushed, hair disheveled, and clothes damp with dew. It happens maybe 3 or 4 times a month. There are even whispers among the staff that she's the Earl's mistress, and he's none the wiser. Oh, and another rumor that she's a spy for another lord. Exus frowned, a flicker of unease in his expression. A man, he thought, and then another. He sighed. Perhaps it's to be expected. She is a woman, after all. He recalled her usual impassive expression during their chess matches, a memory from her younger days. Then, he pictured another man's arms wrapped around her, holding her close. His expression turned glacial. Arms crossed tightly, his displeasure evident. He listened as she declared, I win. Exus met her gaze directly. Very well, he said. What is your desire? Deon, as if having contemplated this for a considerable time, spoke without hesitation. Implement a policy to consolidate the refuse collection. Her request caught him off guard. Not jewels, not fine dresses, but this? Astonishing. After a hard-fought victory, one typically craved some form of trophy. But why the issue of garbage? Sensing his scrutiny, Deon elaborated. In the crowded parts of the city, women often give birth on piles of refuse. Children play and eat amongst the garbage. Men sleep in it. Exus responded matter-of-factly. That's because they are commoners. Deon's reply was sharp. The commoners are the Lord's face. A chuckle escaped Exus's lips. An interesting notion. He frowned, a thought taking root. Did this suggestion come from a man? He wondered. A bold, educated foreigner, perhaps. But this woman's way of thinking is entirely different, he mused. Intellect and culture are shaped by environment. No matter how intelligent a person may be, a slave who has only ever lived in a different environment from the ruling class couldn't possibly conceive of such an idea. Could man have influenced her this profoundly? The maid's words resurfaced in his memory, like a woman who has just tumbled in the grass. Folding his arms, Exus addressed Deon. You asked me to create a policy for this reason alone. Every summer, there are widespread epidemics because of the carelessly discarded waste, Deon replied. Exus disagreed. No one thinks that way. I do, Deon stated calmly. If you create too many rules, Exus countered, people will think rules are useless. Unfazed, Deon continued. Stop the indiscriminate dumping of animal carcasses. Simply ensure that rotting refuse doesn't accumulate within the city walls. Exus smiled. Very well. Then try to persuade me. There must be a reason for engaging in politics, a reason the other party can understand. Deon regarded him silently for a moment, then pressed her lips together before speaking. In summer, so many die from epidemics, and in winter, about the same number perish from hunger. It would be better if this could be prevented. If everyone were healthy, the number of people capable of working would increase, and it would be natural for the land to become more fertile. Exer added, people don't have a concept of waste. They don't know what to share and what to throw away. Deon silently reached out, picking up an apple core and a bunch of grapes. It's enough for them to know that garbage is something that cannot be reused. Watching the composed woman, Exer thought, she answers clearly and quickly. Whoever the man is that influenced her, he helped her hone the thoughts she came up with herself. The thought struck Exer during their conversation. As expected, I don't like this one bit. He couldn't help but frown deeply. Seeing his displeasure, Deon asked a question that startled Exer. Can it be done? He gave a wry smile, realizing something. It was he himself who had spoken boldly the day before. If you win, as long as it's within reason, I will respect your opinion. He had set the rules himself, hoist by his own petard. Looking at Deon's determined expression, Exer chuckled, covering his mouth. Let's try expanding the scope of the game. The next day, as Zephyr was cleaning the garden, he suddenly heard someone ask, "What are you doing with the garbage? Tell me what you're thinking." Rob, standing on the porch, questioned him. Outside the fortress, roads were under construction, and dust flew everywhere. Inside the castle, it was also noisy due to the construction sounds. Zephyr, what in the world are you doing at a time like this? Hearing the question, Zephyr turned his face indifferently and replied, "The farm equipment rental warehouse is almost complete, so the goods will be delivered tomorrow. Everyone is working hard right now." Rob furrowed his brows in annoyance. It's a mess. Why are you doing such a crazy thing? Zephyr also spoke in a not-so-pleased tone. Garbage. The Lord said he's going to implement a new rule, gathering all the garbage in one place. He said that if you want to teach the people, the higher-ups must do good deeds first. Do I look happy about it? Seeing his dejected appearance, Rob reached out and scratched his face lightly, saying innocently, "Well, I really didn't know about this." Zephyr remained silent. The current situation, the census had been completed and the boundaries of the farmers' lands had been drawn. Starting yesterday, families with a large workforce had enough land, while families with fewer people were allocated appropriately sized plots. Until now, all the land and property harvested from the land belonged to the Lord. All the grain harvested in autumn was paid to the Lord as tax, and they only received a small ration. This time, land was allocated to the farmers, and in return, they would donate a certain percentage of their agricultural products. It could be considered that the land was attached to the farmers, but due to the war, bandits and wanderers were increasing. Zephyr felt a slight headache, but no matter how he thought about it, this was too big a change. Rob, standing on the porch, slammed his hand against the wall to express his discontent. I've always believed that our Lord will wage a war of aggression, if not now, then in the near future. I think there must be a reason why he took over this small Orlan region. Although they voluntarily paid tribute every year, fearing invasion from neighboring countries, the nobles are still fighting, and the old king is powerless. So, at this time, everyone, both domestic and foreign, is afraid and wary of our Lord. Zephyr listened quietly as he expressed his thoughts, not offering any opinions on the matter, or perhaps concealing them. At this point, Rob stopped beating around the bush and asked directly, "Is this chaos caused by that woman?" Zephyr asked with feigned nonchalance. "Which woman?" Rob clenched his fists. "You know who I'm talking about." Zephyr still pretended ignorance, saying, "Let me see." Rob continued his grumbling. "That woman is a lioness. She looks as thin as a bird, but inside, she's a lioness. You know lionesses usually do the hunting, right?" Zephyr lifted his head in annoyance. "What are you talking about?" Rob replied, "Nothing much so far. I'm just worried about Renaud." When Deon ran away, it was Renaud who found her in the Surlease forest. He's a very loyal and quiet knight, so you can entrust him with anything. A woman meddling between men at a time like this, Zephyr looked thoughtfully at Rob. Hopefully, he can explain himself clearly. Rob didn't hide the fact that he couldn't take his eyes off her when she walked by. Well, not just Renaud, everyone else too, drawn in by the woman's strange charm. Zephyr glanced over, asking his companion, "Do you think it'll be all right?" Rob sighed, replying, "Since he's strong-minded, he'll probably be fine." Then he suddenly exclaimed, "Hey, Zephyr, should I kill her?" Rob asked, not sounding like he was joking at all. He said to Zephyr, "That woman will ruin our master. If there's any sign, tell me immediately. Tell me, even if he gets angry, even if I get beheaded, I don't care. We have to keep the master away from that woman, right?" A dangerous glint flickered in Rob's eyes. Zephyr was startled by the audacious idea, then quickly turned his face away. "Haha," Rob said with amusement. "I've made Zephyr fall into the world of inner conflict for more than 10 seconds. She's definitely a great woman." Zephyr sighed. "Yeah, a great woman, great." The previous day, upon entering Exus's room, Zephyr had seen many strange pieces of paper on the table. After a closer look, Zephyr asked the man, lying on the other side in surprise, "Kiss coupons?" Exus replied, "I'm just doing this for now. If I don't, I'll regret it. I'm collecting them to use. Use them all at once." Zephyr asked, "You're like a squirrel collecting nuts." Exus rolled his eyes. "It's not a sign of contentment," Zephyr retorted, "but it's similar." Exus chuckled, looking at the documents Zephyr had just handed him. After reading them, he handed the documents back to Zephyr, asking, "Are you free tonight?" Zephyr nodded. "No," Exus said, "then come with me to patrol the roads." Zephyr took the documents, bundled them up, and turned his face to reply, "All right." He had his own thoughts. "I heard Deon leaves the castle late at night, and then comes back. It's amusing that the Lord imitates those strategies of playing with women, but the fact that she isn't married must also be a deliberate outcome. He doesn't even care about the woman's private life, but I'm sure he's not following her and doing as he pleases, right?" Just then, the image of his cold-hearted lord acting like a squirrel collecting nuts flashed through Zephyr's mind, irritating him. He sighed and stepped forward to ask, "If you collect X's coupons, how would you use them?" Hearing this, an interested expression appeared on Exus's face. "Oh my, I haven't thought about that, but it's a good idea." Zephyr felt like he had just helped the enemy, holding his head and lamenting, "Oh, my head." Exus whistled cheerfully. "What a great idea, as expected of my aid." Just like that, night fell quickly, shrouding the fortress in an eerie silence. Exus and 2 other men wore black cloaks, covering their heads, while their lord stood behind a wall with his arms crossed. Zephyr slumped down in frustration, thinking, "I hope Deon doesn't show up soon." A sound not far away alerted the two. Deon drifted past in a cloak, not noticing anyone here. Exus watched her, his brow furrowed in suspicion. Probably every 3 or 4 days. The two hid under a tree not far from her, and one of them accidentally stepped on a small twig beneath the grass. The sound startled Deon, and she instinctively turned her head. Fortunately, the two quickly ducked behind the bushes. Exus, deeply displeased, lowered his voice and chastised his subordinate. "Instead of shuffling paperwork in the office, you should be exercising. It's shameful for someone called a general to be caught red-handed trailing a woman." Zephyr felt wronged, glancing at Exus. There were things the mercenary dared not say. His lord trailing a woman for personal reasons was truly vexing. The two stealthily continued to follow Deon. Suddenly, Exus stopped, stunned by the sight before him. He quickly regained his composure, chuckling to himself. "She's a bold woman, no matter how you look at it." Zephyr, behind him, unaware of what strange thing Exus had seen, took a step forward, curious. Deon, oblivious to being followed, stood at the edge of the shimmering lake, removing her cloak. Bathed in the pale moonlight, her skin gleamed, revealing the smooth, jade-white curve of her back. Exus's eyes sharpened like blades. He turned his head, silencing Zephyr with a look. Zephyr immediately closed his eyes and retreated with an understanding nod. Having shed her clothes, Deon stepped gracefully into the lake. Exus sat cross-legged on a rock, watching her with his head cocked, thinking, as long as she's not out meeting men, I don't have to worry about nightly brawls anymore. Just then, a humming sound startled him. Deon, immersed in the water, was singing a sweet melody. Oh lover, don't cross that river." In the end, why haven't you crossed that river yet? Exus was captivated by her song. It's like a foreign folk song, perhaps from her homeland. I feel much better now. To think, I've never seen that woman relax or smile. But in this moment, she hides nothing, neither her body nor her soul. He clenched his fist, looked up at the night sky, and fell into contemplation. Looking at the tilt of those constellations, the weather might turn cold soon. He chuckled softly. If I let her bathe in such cold water, she'll catch a cold. Zephyr, Zephyr, sitting beside him, naturally heard every word. He sighed inwardly. I don't know why, but I have a bad feeling about this, so I'm a little worried. Deon is like a poisonous flower, exceedingly beautiful, full of allure, but in the end, she's a woman who can kill a man. He recalled Rob's words from that morning. That woman will ruin our Lord. If there's any sign, please tell me immediately. Should I kill that woman? Zephyr sighed, unsure of what to do. The next evening, the chessboard was laid out on the table once more. The loser's cards were handed to the winner. Exer reached out and took the cards nonchalantly, asking, "How is the waste disposal going? Is it to your liking?" Deon replied impassively, "Yes." Exer smiled, calculating. It's good to see the policies I suggested being implemented, because the joy of turning imagination into reality. The so-called policy is if you fix some things, the remaining things must fit together to create something better. It's clear she's put a lot of effort into this. Of course, she wants to try other things as well. Just as he was pondering, Deon made another move. Exer lowered his head, speaking confidently. The winning streak continues, doesn't it? The fun of the game seems to be waning. He pulled out a card. At times like these, we need a little prelude, don't we? Deon, maintaining her composure, said, "Tell me your request." Exer suggested, "I want you to bathe at a set time. Most days, around 10 p.m. The water will start heating at 9:30. Soak for about 30 minutes. Deon couldn't hide her curiosity, tilting her head quizzically. "Why such a request?" Exer sighed, explaining, "I just said, it's just a small prelude." He thought to himself, "Because I promised not to touch your body." Then, Exer continued, "Bathing together would be more fun, but that seems far too difficult. Every little detail is important. Bathe until the scent of your body dissolves into the water. What does your body smell like? I wonder." Exer smiled slyly. "Besides, if you don't like it, then forget about it." As soon as he finished speaking, Deon replied, "I'll do it." Seeing her obedience, Exer smiled in satisfaction as he pulled out 3 winning cards. He cleared his throat and said to her, "Starting tonight," as Deon soaked comfortably in the steaming hot water. Exer noted, "She's been bathing with hot water in the tub, as I instructed ever since that night. I started delaying my personal hygiene time so that Deon could relax and wash up. She seems to be getting more and more accustomed to her time in the tub. She's a slave, and I'm the only one in the world who can make her dreams come true. I hope she realizes that. A glimmer of hope is sure to rise between us. I believe it will." Several days passed. One day, as Exer was resting in bed, a subordinate suddenly rushed in to report urgent news. "Oh no, Deon is missing. I can't find her anywhere." Exer frowned, the pleasant dream from moments before turning to ash. "And then I suddenly receive a report that she's gone missing." He stood at the window with his arms crossed, looking out at the rain, his brow furrowed in thought. Because she's always been a misunderstood woman, I wonder if this time will be like the last. I suppose so, but even though it's late, she still hasn't returned this time. Exer turned his head and looked at Zephyr behind him. Sensing hostility, Zephyr quickly explained, "It wasn't me." However, Exer still clenched his fists and frowned at him. Feeling extremely uncomfortable, Zephyr asked directly, "Do you suspect me?" Exer didn't answer, turning his face back to the interior of the room. Outside, soldiers, servants, everyone was mobilized, searching for Deon in the rain. Exer muttered under his breath, "It's obvious something has happened to her. Find her before it's too late." Zephyr said impatiently, "She must have run away." But Exer affirmed with a single, firm word, "No." Zephyr tried to rouse his infatuated master. "Yes, it's too late now. She wasn't a woman to be trusted from the beginning. Did you believe her, Exer?" Now, with his hand on the window, he heard the question, but didn't answer, frowning, deeply pained. Zephyr deliberately continued, "From the very beginning, she wasn't a woman to be trusted. Did you believe her?" Exer remained silent, lost in his own thoughts. After a few seconds, he finally spoke. "She knows I'm useful to her, so there's no reason for her to run away." Hearing this, Zephyr felt extremely frustrated and retorted loudly, "Useful?" He vented his long-held dissatisfaction with his master. "Are you going mad over that woman now? Are you lowering yourself, making yourself useful to her?" Exer's eyes turned fierce, like a wild beast that had just opened its eyes. And those eyes, for the first time, looked at Zephyr. Zephyr felt a bit panicked, but he suppressed his fear and continued, "Deon, I admit she's a special woman, but she's a foreigner, and she's also a slave. Exus withdrew his terrifying gaze and asked, holding his head wearily, "So?" Zephyr tried to make him understand. "You shouldn't fall for a woman like that. The future mistress by your side must be more beneficial than detrimental. Don't you know that yourself?" Exus roared furiously. "So?" At this moment, Exus's emotions were unstable. He was angry, but quickly regained his composure. He said to Zephyr, "If I have to choose between her and the Empire, then I'll choose her without hesitation." Hearing this, Zephyr could no longer remain calm. He called out Exus's name, "My lord." Exus glanced over and called his subordinate, "Zephyr, you know how I keep people by my side. I didn't use nobles, but you, a child who was once beaten, as my aide. I use Rob, who was once a hunter, as a knight. But now you say she can't just because she's a slave. Well, then let me ask you, how is Deon any different from you?" Zephyr pursed his lips, listening to him, then slowly opened his mouth. "That's a completely different matter." Exus glanced over dismissively. "What? Just because Deon is a woman?" Zephyr shouted again. "She ran away from you." "Then leave," Exus declared, his voice ringing with finality. "If you cannot accept my choice, then leave." Zephyr froze, the bluntness of the words striking him like a physical blow. He hadn't expected their disagreement over a woman to escalate to this. Zephyr gripped the arms of his chair, struggling to compose himself. A strange, heavy silence descended upon the room, each man lost in his own thoughts, grappling with the weight of the unspoken. After a long moment, Zephyr wearily rubbed his forehead. "Do you love her?" he asked, his voice strained. Exus paused, then answered quietly, I'm not certain yet, but it's gotten to the point where I'm telling you to leave." "This isn't a whim." Exus added, his voice low. Zephyr sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "You've lost your mind," Zephyr insisted. "She'll never open her heart to you." "I don't care," Exus retorted, raking a hand through his hair and closing his eyes as if in pain. "I don't care what happens. As long as she's mine, that's enough. But if she falls into someone else's hands..." Exus's eyes snapped open, a dangerous glint in their depths. "Then I'll destroy her myself." Just then, a subordinate's anxious voice broke the tension. "We found her." Exus and Zephyr turned sharply. After a hurried exchange, Exus swiftly threw on his cloak. "The livestock feed shed?" he confirmed. The subordinate nodded. "Yes, sir." Exus hurried towards the shed, a throng of soldiers and servants holding torches illuminating the path. Here, within the fortress walls, he thought incredulously, "I never imagined she was right under my nose." He quickened his pace, the subordinates parting to make way. Exus's boots splashed through puddles as he drew closer to the shed. Finally, he saw her, Deon's small form, curled up asleep amidst a pile of straw. A wave of relief washed over Exus as he gazed at her trembling form. The knot of anxiety in his chest loosened. The knowledge that she hadn't run away filled him with a profound sense of satisfaction. "Thank goodness you're safe," he murmured. "I was so worried you'd been hurt. With the explosion and everything, it's been chaos. I've been frantic." Exus's expression turned serious as he addressed the assembled men. "Listen up," he called out, "for your hard work. I'll treat you all to a feast of meat and ale. Furthermore," he continued, "all scheduled activities for tomorrow are canceled so you can rest properly." Exus knew the reward was excessive for the task, but he didn't care. "If you're up late in this dreadful weather with no rest," he explained, "all that fatigue will turn into resentment, and it will be directed at Deon." His actions were driven by his concern for her. He turned to a nearby guard. "Don't let anyone near her. Bring a thick blanket and a heated stone. Wrap it in cloth and bring it here," he instructed. Once everyone had dispersed, Exus approached the still sleeping Deon. He realized she was burning with fever, her body drenched in sweat. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. Seeing her so vulnerable, alone in this place, it seemed as though there was no one in the world this woman trusted. The charade they were playing seemed to have taken a heavy toll on her. A tender smile touched his lips. He reached down and, with practiced gentleness, scooped the unconscious Deon into his arms. He held her close, letting her sleep peacefully against his chest, a source of warmth in the cold rain. Feeling the heat radiating from her, he mused, With the fever, she feels more human. Before, she was like a doll carved from stone, cold, sharp, beautiful. Suddenly, Deon's eyes fluttered open, then closed again, caught between sleep and wakefulness. The subordinate returned with a blanket and heated stone as instructed. Exer quickly took the stone, carefully wrapped in cloth, and gently placed it on Deon's stomach to warm her and ease her discomfort. Then he unfolded the blanket and draped it over her shivering form, his movements infinitely tender and loving. In the romantic gloom of the rainy night, two people from vastly different worlds huddled together in the corner of a small, dirty feed shed. The night sky, a canvas of wonder, glittered with countless stars. Fireflies danced among the branches and across the ground, their tiny lights flickering like fallen stars. The moon, a brilliant orb in the inky blackness, bathed the world in its ethereal glow, illuminating every leaf with an almost unnatural clarity. Within the dilapidated livestock feed shed, amidst a pile of dry hay, a scene of stark contrast unfolded. A large man cradled a young woman in his arms. She was gravely ill, her breath shallow and weak, her life seemingly tethered to the rhythmic beat of his heart. After applying warm stones and draping a heated towel over Deon, Exer gently kissed her forehead. The worry that had etched lines on his face throughout the dark night began to recede. Suddenly, his eyes brightened, focusing on something just beyond their intimate embrace. His arm tightened around Deon. She stirred, her weary eyelids fluttering open, revealing the faint glimmer of her golden eyes. "Look," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. Once assured of her improved state, Exer stretched his legs and leaned back against the rough wall of the shed, settling into a more comfortable position to hold her. He began to speak, his voice tinged with a distant sadness. "I was granted the title of Lord at the tender age of 13. My father died young, and I nearly lost my standing, my lands, my power." His eyes held a hollowness as he recounted his past, a hint of deep-seated resentment flickering within their depths. "From that moment on, I learned how to truly live." Deon closed her eyes, her head resting against his chest, listening intently. He seemed dissatisfied with his present, too, as if the painful past had irrevocably shaped the man he had become. Now, he possessed the cold, calculating gaze of a seasoned leader. "Power," he continued, his voice hardening, "is something others greedily enjoy. But if you want to enjoy it, you must fight for it, because power is finite. It's not distributed equally." He raised a hand as if to illustrate his point. Deon, her consciousness returning, stirred slightly, grasping the meaning of his words. "Slaves don't have that right," she murmured. A soft chuckle escaped Exer's lips as he looked down at her. Indeed, the power he held was not insignificant. He had his sword, ever ready to defend what he claimed as his. He had his lands, a tangible symbol of his authority. "I am a lord," he stated, his voice resonating with quiet strength. "I have a great deal of power. Furthermore, I am not content with what I currently possess. I continue to strive for more, so you needn't struggle fiercely against others." Deon, nestled in the arms of this powerful man, looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "Can I trust you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Seeing the vulnerability in her gaze, Exer continued, determined to prove his sincerity. "You could take power from me. You need only fight me." It was an immense offer, one beyond Deon's wildest dreams. She stared at him, her expression a mixture of astonishment and seriousness. He, in turn, gazed back at her with an intensity that spoke volumes. Holding her close, he asked, "Are you not drawn to me?" He then enumerated the exceptional freedoms she could enjoy under his protection. "When you are in pain, you can say you are in pain. When you dislike something, you can say you dislike it." The romantic moonlight imbued the scene with a poetic quality. "In the sincerity of my words today, and after all that has happened," Exer continued, his voice soft, "you have the right to honestly say you want freedom." He even playfully encouraged her, "Fight me directly and win." Deon seemed overwhelmed by this powerful man. Perhaps Exer truly harbored unique feelings for her as he expressed his desires. "I will make you break down. That is the plan, to make you laugh, cry, get angry, and complain." As he spoke, he closed his eyes, as if imagining the pleasure he would derive from seeing her express such a range of emotions. Astonished by his revelation, Deon stared at him, her eyes wide. She was truly beautiful, even in her weakened state, her hair unkempt. In that moment, Deon shyly lowered her head, a pout forming on her lips. "I hate you," she mumbled. Exer, however, didn't react with anger or reproach. He simply smiled, understanding the root of her hatred. "I know," he replied softly. "I would rather see a face filled with anger than one devoid of expression." And so, bathed in the moonlight that streamed through the holes in the shed's roof, they continued to speak, their voices hushed and intimate. "How long have you had the fever?" he asked. "About 2.5 days," she replied weakly. It was late, and everyone was drifting toward sleep. Even the formidable Exer, despite his strength, yawned and stretched. He'd been asking questions, and then, mid-sentence, Deon had drifted off. It was then that Exer noticed something peculiar. An exquisitely beautiful girl, her flowing hair illuminated by the moonlight, her gentle golden eyes shimmering, her lips smooth and her skin flushed, was gazing at him. Outside, the rustle of branches and the flutter of birdsong filled the air. Inside, two figures were close, one cradled in the other's arms, held tightly. They stared at each other for a long moment. The girl moved first. Her small hand reached out and rested on his chest, near his heart. She leaned closer to his flawlessly handsome face, while he remained motionless, watching to see what she would do. He closed his eyes, savoring the moment as her soft, warm hand caressed his face. She gently cupped his cheek, and he opened his eyes, gazing at her hand against his skin. He looked at her, his eyes shining with affection. Realizing she was being watched, she quickly withdrew her hand, startled by the closeness between them. Exer, quickly surmising why Deon had placed her hand on his face, smiled knowingly. "Were you checking if I had a fever from being in the rain?" he asked. Deon's cheeks flushed crimson. Embarrassed, she nevertheless answered, "Yes." He closed his eyes, lowered his head, and sighed at this innocent girl. Lifting his head, he looked at her and said, "I desire you, body and soul. More accurately, I am captivated by you, and therefore, I take pity on you, a slave." Deon felt a pang of sadness. He hadn't said he loved her. Was it only pity he felt? Did he believe she had to obey him simply because she was a slave? Exer, still asserting his position and authority over her, continued, "I could force you, but I would prefer your willingness." Though slightly moved by his earlier actions and words, Deon now recoiled, turning her face away. "I will not lie with a man," she said. "I do not love." He reached out instantly, startling her. "Very well," he said firmly. Stroking her hair, he continued, "Try courting me." The scene shifted to another room, brighter, dominated by a majestic red banner and a large white stone fireplace. A chair with a red velvet cushion sat beside a table holding an inkwell and quill. A hand placed a stack of papers on the table, 12 in all. It was Exer and Deon. Deon looked much healthier, sitting properly across from him. Exer pulled out a chair and sat down. The room was large, filled with various items. Crates, beer barrels, shelves, and a large chest. They sat at a long table covered with a tablecloth. Candles provided light for their conversation. Exer sighed. "I've been thinking about saving up," he began, "but my patience is wearing thin." It was unclear what Exer was referring to, but he grinned, adding, "But this might be enough to keep me happy all night." He looked at her expectantly, crossing his legs and waiting. When Deon didn't move, he continued, "If you don't like it, I'll come over there." Deon decided it was best to go to him, hoping he might be gentler later. She stood and walked towards him. They sat close together. The scene was a bedroom now, a large bed visible behind them. Exer reached out to touch Deon's back. She blushed, and again, she recoiled. He touched her hair nervously. "Don't," she said. He seemed disappointed, sensing her apprehension. However, he hadn't intended to stop. He quickly grasped her small waist with both hands. Deon cried out in surprise. They were pressed close together, face to face, bodies touching. Exer held Deon tightly. She, still shy, held a hand up between them, looking at him. He pulled her closer, his arm around her back. A flicker of annoyance flashed in her eyes at his forceful actions. But the gentleness had left Exer's eyes. The beast within him was about to take over. He couldn't wait any longer. Her body pressed close against his. He brought his face near hers, his voice a low murmur. "If I recall correctly, you said only once, from the moment I touch your lips to the moment I let go." At this, Exus gazed deep into her eyes. I believe you have some experience now, so this is going to be one long single time now. Consider this a warning for the long kiss you are about to receive. With that, the two of them were passionately entangled, one of his hands supporting her arm, the other at the back of her head, pressing her into his kiss. She clung to him with one hand, relishing the kiss. It was indeed a deep kiss, one that left her slightly breathless, a moan escaping her lips. They pushed their tongues together, his sweeping across the cavern of her mouth, causing their saliva to mingle, becoming more glistening and intimate than ever before. The kiss was sweet and passionate, with no sign of ending. When it finally did break, Deon had a gasp for air. After that overwhelmingly irresistible kiss, with the moon still shining brightly outside, Exus chuckled at Deon's reaction. Then, he reached out and breathed gently against her ear, causing her to blush crimson. She immediately pushed him away in protest. "Only once," she managed to say. "Only once," the cunning man immediately retorted. But no one said only one kiss on the lips, right? He had already planned it. One kiss on every spot would do. The girl beneath him was utterly defeated by her lack of defenses against this powerful opponent. The space in the room became quieter than ever, every gasp clearly audible. Exus moved his kisses from her lips to her ear and now to her neck. It wasn't just a peck. He lingered, licking with his tongue, nipping lightly with his teeth, causing her to cry out from the ticklish sensation. The sound was beyond embarrassing, but she didn't seem to intend to resist now. Noticing this, Exus chuckled inwardly, as if he had gained a huge windfall. He pulled down her outer garment, drawing her into a deeper kiss. One hand supported her from below, the other secured her arm, leaving her unable to refuse him. Then, they paused for her to breathe. Exus was considerate, not impatient at all, just a little forceful. The second kiss pushed her beyond her limits, still ongoing, long and wet, the two of them still entangled. Though Exus had just experienced the passionate and lingering kiss, his eyes caught something. It turned out that the girl in his arms was still counting something, even as they were making love. He immediately recognized the meaning of her two outstretched fingers. Even at this moment, he couldn't believe she was still counting. Without hesitation, he reached out and touched her chest, undoing her outer garment. Although she was slightly surprised by his actions and raised her hands to cover her chest, she didn't protest, knowing he had her permission. Exus leaned down and began his long-awaited work. However, he was dissatisfied with the hand that was preventing him from proceeding with his next plan. It turned out she was still shielding her chest, not allowing him to have his way with her body. Exus had to compromise, proposing an agreement between him and her. "I accept all the conditions you put forward, so this agreement might be fair to both of us." To be extra sure, he patiently asked again, "I'll continue. You don't object, right?" Clearly, deep down, she couldn't resist this handsome man and his sweet kisses, but her reason controlled her brain, and she said, "Only one kiss." Exus said, "I know," but it was knowing in his way, not hers. This time, he only needed a few fingers to secure her slender wrists. He pushed her down on the sofa, lifting her shirt, exploring her slender waist. The fluids from his mouth now stained her navel, thanks to his playful tongue, becoming exceptionally glistening and alluring in the dim candlelight of the night. He looked at her face, making sure that this special girl of his wasn't scared or resentful, wanting to resist his actions. He continued for a long while, the only sounds the occasional murmur from each kiss he placed upon her sweet, soft flesh, punctuated by the quickening of her breath and a few soft moans escaping her lips. He grew bolder, slipping his hand beneath her skirt, but stopped immediately. He had caressed her for a long time, but he still knew the boundaries, so she wouldn't be disappointed in him. With one hand still resting on the slender thigh revealed beneath her skirt, he spoke, "I won't take off your clothes, because I won't allow this to go all the way." She didn't know how to feel anymore. One moment he was forceful, the next he wanted to stop. She was also shy, apprehensive about her own desires. He seemed to know his little slave well. As he looked at her, seeing her eyes, looking back at her from above, Exus speculated. When she's tired, her face becomes completely expressionless, but now, anxiety is clearly written all over her face. Realizing she was being watched like this, she became even more embarrassed, lowering her head, not daring to look at him again. She also wanted this to end quickly, and Exus guessed as much. I'm guessing she'll be stubborn for a while longer, but seeing her hands and body trembling, I think she's reacting faster than I expected. Looking at her, he hesitated for a moment before the stubborn girl. Should I stop here today? I wish she were more enthusiastic, but I'm afraid she'll be scared. Perhaps because he clearly saw every corner of the frail body before him, he was reminded of the feverish illness she had just suffered a few days prior, which pricked his conscience, kicking away the beast of desire and thinking of the little slave. This was just the reader's speculation. No one knew what Exus's true plan was. They only knew that he then reached out and gently stroked the hair on her neck. He took her hand and then tucked it into the very sheet from earlier, the one he thought would satisfy him tonight. He spoke as if trying to get her attention, and although she heard him and knew what he was doing, she didn't understand the purpose of the action. He leaned down and placed a quick kiss on her forehead, the gentle act surprising her. She met his gaze, her expression filled with confusion. He rubbed his hand against his lips, savoring the taste of the kiss. He chuckled softly. A fleeting kiss without any lust? I never thought I'd receive one. Deon was utterly shocked by his series of actions. She froze, still unable to comprehend what was happening. Then, Exus stood up quietly and reached for a large cloth on the table. He shook the cloth, and then he noticed the girl below making some sort of movement. She lay in a rather defensive posture, glancing up at him, her hands pulling at her shirt, legs curled up as much as possible. Unfazed, he pressed his thumb against the small, dark spot on her slender waist. Then he gently caressed it with his long fingertips. He spoke with the most casual expression as he caressed her. There's a little mole here. Then he placed a hand on her back, lifting her waist, and placed another quick kiss on the small thing. Seeing that she didn't resist, he pushed his luck, lifting her thigh and gently licking it with his hot tongue, which startled her into looking up. But before her brain could react, pleasure shot through her, causing her to throw her head back and let out a few moans. Exus immediately realized how sensitive the girl was. As soon as she realized her actions, her face was now redder than a tomato. Hearing laughter beside her ear, she could only raise her hands to cover her foolish mouth that had let out such an untimely sound. Seeing her reaction clearly, he gave the most affectionate smile. He looked down at her and chuckled again. Then he thought, the plump meat has already reached my mouth. It would be a waste not to taste it. At once, his hand gripped her thigh and began to move. Now she couldn't stop even if she wanted to, nor could she resist. Her lips trembled, and she could only sob silently in front of this lord. Unable to discern his expression, she only knew that Exus's lips also curved, and he swallowed hard before this beauty. He began to lower himself towards her, and only then did she see every line of his face, so perfect, like a masterpiece she couldn't look away from. Her pupils grew brighter and brighter in the presence of this captivating work of art. He not only bent down, but also wanted a response from her. So he lifted her head, opened his mouth wide, and immediately kissed her lips, skillfully slipping his tongue in her mouth and holding her tightly. This kiss was longer than any before. Just as things were progressing, a giant and vocal third wheel walked in, shattering the atmosphere. Oh dear, oh dear. A man in a leather cap and coat stood behind them, laughing heartily. Deon, startled by the stranger's entrance, panicked, while Exus immediately grabbed a cloth from the table to cover her, looking displeased towards the source of the noise. Not just one person, but 5. 4 men stood behind, dressed in identical white gold clothes and white hats, while the man in the lead wore red-toned clothing, a red hat, and a red coat. They stood boldly at the doorway, and upon closer inspection, this man also possessed an impassive face and eyes like Exus's, except his clothes were neater, and a pair of jade-green eyes stood out most prominently against his red attire. Exus sat, trying to hide his little lover, preventing anyone from harming her or approaching her with any intention of taking her away. Until now, both sides remained silent, neither speaking a word. Then, the interrupting man placed a hand on his chest and said, I knocked, but no one answered. How rude of me. But even though he acknowledged his rudeness, he still stood boldly in someone else's room. As for Exus, he seemed uninterested in the sudden appearance of this fellow and his soldiers. Moreover, he was somewhat annoyed. This unwelcome arrival turned out to be Prince Dirk. Unwilling to argue or hear anything from this prince, he said slowly, If you have eyes, you should see that I'm busy. Close the door and get out. Prince Dirk continued speaking casually, without a shred of politeness. Not only that, but he sighed with feigned grievance. Isn't this the infamous playboy, Gwen X Malcutt? Today, I thought I would receive a warm welcome from a guest from afar. Only now did he begin to look around with sharper eyes, while Exus, already quite angry, gestured towards a spot, giving him a hint to leave before anything untoward happened. Seeing that he had interrupted something important, he took off his hat and left. Exus waited patiently for the fellow to leave, his legs turning 180 degrees as he clumsily walked away. Gradually, by this time, everyone had returned to normal. Deon stood up gently, and Exus's gaze swept over her figure. Just then, he reached out and grabbed her wrist, as if something had transpired between them. The gentle touch was enough to make their gleaming eyes meet. Exus continued to look, showing no intention of letting go of her or looking away, all his attention focused on her. Now that the room had returned to its private state before the interruption, he opened her hand and placed the paper from earlier inside, making Deon a little curious. Then he stood up and walked away, leaving her alone, holding the small brown papers in her hand, still puzzled and unsure of their purpose. She unfolded the papers in her hand, the sound of rustling filling the air. Oh my God, their lord was so childish. After such a seemingly mysterious act, it turned out to be just a few pieces of paper with "free kiss" written on them. However, it was still a memorable night for the two of them, a night under the magical night sky where many things happened and many hearts were opened. Dawn arrived once more, and daytime came. In one location, small tents stood close together, fully equipped with weapons, food, water, wagons, and horses. People were enjoying their breakfast. By the largest yellow tent, and the only one of its kind, stood 2 guards. What was inside, after all? The interior of the tent was Spartan, furnished only with a round table bearing a single flickering candle. 3 figures occupied the space. Exus, legs crossed, sat regally on a sofa tucked into a corner. Prince Dirk, the red-haired man who had interrupted the previous night, stood at the table with another man, seemingly attending to him. The younger man was helping Dirk dress, the process highlighting his tall, well-built frame. He began to speak of road construction. Does Gwen Exus Marcotte truly intend to establish a nation within the Orlan region? The prince had a peculiar habit of addressing others by their full names. He glanced back at the figures seated behind him, gauging their reaction. Exus, the platinum-haired man with pale violet eyes, chewed thoughtfully on something, then replied with an air of nonchalance. If you were a king, would you build a palace on such a small, insignificant piece of land? Prince Dirk, seemingly agreeing with Exus's assessment, responded. Meanwhile, the other man finished his task and bowed his head in deference before taking his leave. Though not seen from the front, the red-haired prince, with his striking emerald green eyes, was no less captivating than Exus. Sensing the lingering presence of the other man, Dirk addressed the empty space behind him, his voice laced with a warning. You're getting older. Shouldn't you be more cautious? You're squandering the vast fortune and power your father left you. You're being a bit intense, Exus retorted, unfazed and even slightly irritated. Or do you want to marry me? Is this a proposal? Despite the romantic implications of the setting, both men's faces remained impassive. Dirk recoiled as if nauseated. What are you talking about? Exus sighed, still seemingly indifferent. If I'm not your wife, why are you so concerned about how I spend my money? Dirk, appearing to take the question more seriously, urged Exus to consider his present and future actions, not just for himself, but for others as well. Well, of course, I've heard that in distant lands, roads are built, but roads usually form naturally where people travel. Dirk attempted to convey his point, and Exus listened, offering gestures of acknowledgement. However, he remained skeptical of Dirk's road-building plans. Is it truly necessary to invest time and money in leveling the ground and laying stones, simply for the convenience of the people? The answer came swiftly, for fun. You invaded Orlan just for fun. The narrative shifts to showcase the array of weaponry within the tent, from small knives for close combat to swords suitable for mounted cavalry. Returning to the 2 men, Exus now sat upright. No, I invaded Orlan because... The reason is utterly absurd. This protagonist is truly hopeless. People say that Trobul's slave is a remarkably beautiful foreign woman. As the most notorious playboy in the Empire, I couldn't ignore her. A record-breaking achievement, indeed. At that moment, the red-haired man beside Dirk sighed deeply, exasperated by the platinum-haired man's flippancy. Exer, who had been holding a small knife, suddenly flung it. It landed squarely in the table beside Dirk, startling and displeasing him. Even your casual actions are so aggressive, Dirk warned. Exer, ever the provocateur, flashed a smile, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction at his accurate throw. It adds to my charm, doesn't it? A horn blared, toot, blown by a young boy in a familiar yellow uniform. It was the signal for the hunt. Exer strode to the tent flap, pulled it open, and stretched languidly, greeting the new day and seemingly ready to embark on the hunt. As Exer stepped out of the tent, Dirk, who seemed to have much more to say, continued his admonishment. His Majesty is furious about your invasion of Orlan, and so am I. Exer raised a finger, signaling for someone to bring his belongings. Dirk, still trying to reason with him, followed Exer out of the tent, closing the distance between them. What are you even thinking? If I am to spare Orlan, someone brought his weapon and respectfully handed it to Exer. I will return it untouched. But he paused, his grip tightening on the sword. But I am determined to get what I want under the bright sun. He held out the blade, the steel glinting, and stated his terms. I must take a woman. From afar, Exer's imposing height was evident. Prince Dirk clearly couldn't match him. The camp around them was deserted, devoid of both people and horses. Hearing the word woman, Dirk, still reeling from the previous exchange, blurted out, Who? Is it that slave girl from the Dreyberg rumors? He bristled at the dismissive term, swiftly corrected by the man who had spent the previous night showering Deon with kisses. She is mine. A low chuckle escaped Dirk. He seemed almost disappointed that the grand conquest was for a mere girl. So, you're giving up Orlan then? He asked again, incredulous. The infuriatingly ambivalent Exer said nothing. No nod, no shake of the head, no indication of an answer at all. He simply shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips. The red-haired prince watched him, speechless, unsure what to say or even think, rendered mute by the man's lack of conviction. Yet a part of him, a pragmatic, calculating part, wanted Exer to stay. He considered it. After all, this was an insignificant backwater. Even if Exer retreated, the place wouldn't last a year. It would be swallowed by the flames of war again. Leaning against his horse, Dirk envisioned a landscape consumed by fire and smoke, the glint of blood beneath a steel blade. Enemy banners fluttering in the wind. In that case, better to let Exer rule here. At least the South would be spared further conflict. On some level, Dirk couldn't claim to fully understand Exer's true nature. This is what His Majesty already knew then, he mused, a flicker of worry in his emerald eyes. But it's also rather concerning. We can't be certain of Exer's loyalty to the crown. The image of a golden crown, studded with glittering jewels, flashed briefly in his mind. Exer, not yet gone, whistled, his gaze lingering on a group of girls chatting and laughing in the distance. Dirk, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow, stepped closer, hoping his next words wouldn't confirm a grim suspicion. You don't intend to turn Orlan into a fortress, he began, his voice tight. Just for sport, do you? At the prince's suggestion, Exer's pale violet eyes lit up. He arched a brow, a sly grin spreading across his face. I hadn't considered that, he admitted, his voice laced with amusement. But to sound intriguing. Once the fortress is built, I'll be sure to invite you over more often. By this time, Dirk's horse was ready, and he prepared to depart. So, he concluded, shaking his head, a fortress falls for a woman. How absurd. He mounted his horse, gathering the reins in his hand. I'm quite curious, he continued, his voice laced with a hint of challenge. What kind of woman could make such a self-indulgent man as yourself act so foolishly? It seems I'll find out tonight. Exer, despite his stated intention to hunt, remained standing, seeing the prince off. His expression was unreadable, giving no hint of his thoughts, feelings, or whether he even cared about Dirk's parting words. The sound of hooves, 5 horses, 5 men, receded slowly, fading into the distant forest and the vast expanse of the mountains. Exer sighed, folding his arms, a look of boredom settling on his features. Dirk's personal appearance must have been a warning to the other nobles. As the prince rode away, Cypher appeared behind Exer, leading a black horse with intelligent, gleaming eyes. His expression shifted faster than a flipping pancake. He'd feigned flippancy in front of Dirk, but in truth, he knew everything. Exer fell into contemplation. I can trust him, he thought, but does this mean His Majesty will directly interfere with all my actions from now on? The thought of the impending royal decree, the one forcing him to marry the princess, that princess with the flowing red hair and the elaborate, off-the-shoulder red gown, surfaced in his mind. He couldn't quite recall her face. They seemed to be a royal family with a passion for the color red from head to toe. People in stories don't overthink things the way we do now, Exer mused, comfortably settled in his saddle. So, arguments need proof to be compelling. And the proof is that Deon is so beautiful. I simply had to invade Orlan. A wry smile played on his lips as he finished this grand declaration. The reins firm in his grasp, his large black horse broke into a steady canter, its hooves clicking against the loose gravel. Perhaps I should go see Deon, he thought aloud. For that reason, I must make sure she looks as beautiful as possible today. Indeed, Cypher replied from behind him, his tone and expression still sullen. Since his arrival, the sky had deepened from a light azure to a rich, almost inky blue. The stars, however, still glittered brightly each night in this land. Melodious music drifted from the warmly lit rooms of the magnificent castle. Inside, a grand and lavish feast seemed to be underway. Tables overflowed with goblets, platters of fragrant delicacies, flickering candles, a whole honey-roasted chicken, and a steaming tureen of vegetable soup. This was no ordinary banquet. The lilting music was provided by a flute player, while important guests occupied red velvet-covered chairs on a raised dais. Below, young women played and danced to the music. Beside them, another banquet table stood, its offerings already partially consumed. Flowing hair appeared from beyond the hallway of the banquet room, and a soldier outside loudly announced, "Enter." As the girl passed him, it became clear that the room was vast, not limited to a single table for honored guests. Tables, each with 2 chairs, were arranged throughout the space. 2 larger, more ornate tables seemed reserved for the hosts of the feast. Absolutely stunning and gorgeous, truly worthy of our Deon. Now, with her hair neatly styled and pulled back, her face was even more striking. Without heavy makeup, she wore only a golden beaded headband across her forehead. Her gown, with off-the-shoulder sleeves, was adorned with blossoming roses along the upper edge. Her arms, partially revealed, were veiled in a thin, translucent fabric that hinted enticingly at the skin beneath. It seemed one of the 2 hosts was Prince Dirk. He was clearly surprised and delighted by the slave girl's appearance, his gaze fixed upon her. The rhythmic click of her heeled shoes echoed through the hall. From this vantage point, the full splendor of Deon's gown was revealed. A long, trumpet-shaped train, sleeves of a similar design, and a sash cinched at her waist, accentuating her slender figure. She strode forward with an air of confidence. The other grand chair belonged to Exer. He couldn't help but preen, filled with pride in the beauty of his newly acquired paramour. She was naturally beautiful, so with a little adornment, she instantly transformed into a goddess, captivating all eyes. This was a stroke of luck for him, as a slave, she had always been unkempt and unnoticed. He sat there, observing her carefully, from her flowing hair and the blush on her cheeks, to her bright golden brown eyes, straight nose, and naturally rosy lips. Not only that, but the gown allowed him to admire the fair skin from her chest to her waist, all of it highlighted and striking his eye. Most captivating was the gentle expression on her face, not too haughty and radiant, nor too comically joyful. It was the softest emotion of a girl. Simply lowering her eyes to the floor, her lips relaxed. After a moment of admiring his handiwork, Prince Dirk had to admit, she truly is captivating. Turning to see the interest in Prince Dirk's eyes, Exer glared at him fiercely. He lifted his goblet and took a sip. Who could deny his skill in choosing his companions? Though he loved women, he was discerning, and he believed he had every right to be. But under the covetous gazes of the guests upon his woman, a burning anger churned within Exer, and it wasn't as pleasurable as he'd imagined. It was clear they were only lusting after Deon's appearance, meticulously adorned as she was, and the fires of their envy burned bright, threatening to erupt. He had to keep drinking, trying to cool the heat, glaring at the brazen guests. He cursed himself, filled with regret. If he'd known it would be like this, he wouldn't have let them dress her so beautifully. In that moment, the music faded from the hushed room, the laughter and dancing of the girls stilled, and every small movement became acutely perceptible. A bulky man in plain clothes, several rings adorning his fingers, pushed his chair back and stood. His head was shaved, his nose slightly hooked, his mouth agape in an unpleasant expression. He bellowed, "She's my slave." And to add to the spectacle, he wore a grotesque brown leather mask. But no one reacted to his arrogant outburst, and he froze, beetle-like, silent for a moment. A small burp escaped his lips, his face flushing crimson. Perhaps he'd imbibed a bit too freely before making such a crude and disrespectful display. The host of the banquet, Exer, was deeply irritated by the guest's reckless behavior. He suppressed his own anger and said politely, "It seems Viscount Silgar has had too much to drink. Surely, nothing here belongs to him." But the man didn't stop, ignoring Exer's displeasure, or perhaps too drunk to register it. He pointed at Deon and shouted, "Her! She's my slave. She ran away 7 years ago." The truth of the matter remained unclear, but Deon maintained an impassive expression, as if she didn't want to confront the situation or even bother to look back at the man who dared to claim her. Because of this slave girl's appearance, he wanted to claim her. "She's my slave. She ran away 7 years ago." It seemed he wasn't so drunk as to be incoherent. He quickly asserted that, according to imperial law, slaves belonged to their previous owners until a contract was written and they were sold. The shrill voice continued to echo through the banquet hall. "She's my slave. I'll have my servants bring the contract, so you'll have to acknowledge my ownership of her." Hatred burned in Exer's eyes. He wanted to kill the fat man. Prince Dirk, seated beside him, noticed the shift in Exer's demeanor and glanced at him. The man lunged from his seat, spitting the words, "This bitch," and reached out with a thick arm to grab Deon and claim her as his own. Deon was too meek, or perhaps she truly was his slave, for she froze, offering no resistance or retort. Just like the night he'd grab her by the hair, he gritted his teeth and pulled her towards him. "You're mine." At that moment, Exer's expression screamed, "This lunatic must be tired of living. He's caused trouble, and now he has the audacity to steal my woman." He shot to his feet, the surrounding tables and chairs crashing together with a cacophony of cracks and groans as if about to splinter. 1443, he gripped her hair tightly, preventing her escape. She looked at him with fear as he brought his face close to hers. I remember these eyes clearly. It was these eyes that drove me mad. Hatred burned in Exer's eyes, violet though they were. He glared at the man and growled, "How dare you?" But he still didn't lunge forward to fight and snatch her back. He sank back in his chair, fists clenched, the veins in his face bulging. But because he was the host of the banquet and there were other guests present, he maintained a semblance of composure. "Are you mad?" He finally exploded, his voice booming, echoing down the halls outside the room where the increasingly unpleasant banquet was being held. "Do you want to die?" This seemed to sober the Viscount somewhat, and he loosened his grip on Deon's hair. Seeing their master's anger, the guards placed their hands on their swords, ready to act at a moment's notice, adding to the man's fear. "Executor, wait. If there's a contract, Viscount Silberge does indeed have the right to claim her. Reserve judgment until a valid contract is presented." Exer couldn't quite comprehend the meaning behind the words spoken by the person seated beside him. But more importantly, because he was a prince, everything should be transparent. Prince Dirk spoke, his voice soft yet firm. "Viscount, please release her." He immediately let her go, and she now recoiled from Prince Dirk's words, having offered no resistance before, perhaps certain that struggling against the bulky man would be futile. After Prince Dirk's soothing words, Exer calmed down somewhat, though the veins in his forehead were still prominent. He eagerly suggested, "What compensation? Any amount, as long as you sign the transfer contract." The fat man said nothing, only raising a hand to remove his mask, an action that puzzled Exer. "See, the Viscount started to burn my face. It's not a small wound. It stretches from my forehead all the way to my cheek, almost completely ruining my face. This is what she did after she ran away 7 years ago. It turned out he hadn't intended to reclaim her for her beauty. He hated this slave for what she had done to him. He wanted revenge. He wanted to torment her." Exer scoffed at the scar on the man's face, the result of the woman's defiance. So it wasn't an accident. A thought flashed through his mind, thinking of the girl. That night must have been terrifying to make her run away like that. Hearing this story, everyone chuckled, whispering behind the man's back, causing the veins on his face to bulge. Not to be outdone, and seemingly wanting to prove something, perhaps even to boast, he said with a perverse smile, "On that girl's waist. Near her navel, there's a small mole, I think." Hearing this, There was perhaps no longer any need to produce the contract. His words reminded Exus of that night, when he had discovered that small, dark spot on her body. Now, knowing the Viscount had touched her too, he felt a deeper unease. What else had happened? He didn't know, and even more sickeningly, the Viscount pointed at Deon and declared loudly, "If the prince permits, I'll strip her clothes off right now to verify, and then I'll take her away." Deon, standing beside him, said nothing. Perhaps her slave status was a label that had rendered her apathetic, resigned to fate, allowing anyone to do anything to her. Exus's lips tightened, his face stiff, as if about to explode. He glared at the Viscount, his violet eyes filled with a terrifying intensity, his brow deeply furrowed. He was brimming with rage. Prince Dirk looked bewildered. Here, strip her clothes in such a crowded place. The incorrigible pervert narrowed his eyes, a filthy smile plastered on his face as he looked at Deon. "She's just a lowly slave, Your Highness." In front of the two men seated in the high chairs, beside the former slave girl who had humiliated him, he insulted her and even Exus a little. Even if I stripped her naked and fed her to the pigs, no one would say anything. However, seeing the Viscount's despicable behavior, the prince interjected, "But she is precious to Dreyberg." Indeed, Dreyberg treasured her as a slave, not as a woman, and did not flaunt her. It was Exus who was being lecherous. Prince Dirk added, "Besides, she belongs to Exus now. Her status dictates that she obeys her master. Demanding her to undress in front of guests is no different from insulting Exus, and therefore, it's impossible." Prince Dirk made a concession on Exus's behalf, reasoning with the Viscount to avoid further chaos. But Exus didn't seem to agree with this solution. "Insulting," he said, his brow still furrowed. "A guest misbehaves in my fortress, and that's not considered an insult? In response to that contract, if you ask me to give up my slave girl, what do you think will happen to you?" There was no need to beat around the bush. If the Viscount stole Deon from him, Exus would invade as he had before, and take her back, simple and quick, but potentially damaging to their relationship. Clearly at a disadvantage, the Viscount was speechless. He gritted his teeth, his brow furrowed, his nose twitching with anger. Humiliated twice in one evening, and yet unable to get what he wanted, Exus continued to express his devotion to the beauty. "If I want to obtain ownership of a woman, I will pay for it with my life." His words left the Viscount both furious and powerless to retaliate. Exus's resolve was absolute. Seated on a chair a step higher, with a superior status, greater power, and a larger physique, Exus looked down at the Viscount with a weary expression. "So Viscount, compromise or combat?" As soon as Exus finished speaking, a soldier clad in formal armor, draped in a cloak, and with a yellow banner wrapped around his leg, drew his sword from its scabbard, ready for battle. Beside him, Deon appeared even more indifferent. Suddenly, a few dark red drops of blood splattered, perhaps a grim reminder of the unpleasant history between Exus and Viscount Silgark. "What do you intend to do?" Exus asked. The past feeling is real as every swing of the sword he'd made. Back in the present, the sword thrown by the soldier clattered to the floor, not far from the Viscount. The near miss startled him. Though previously enraged and drunk, he now seemed to have sobered up, his thoughts clearing. A duel with Exus? Who would play such a disadvantageous game? Seeing himself about to fall into Exus's dangerous trap, he cravenly turned to Prince Dirk, invoking the rules for help. "Your Highness, the rules of the kingdom." It was like being in court, but unfortunately, he was in Exus's domain. If an item should be returned to its owner, but it wanders around, there's no reason for a contract. He stubbornly stuck to his reasoning, wanting Deon back. Infuriated by the Viscount's vulgar words about Deon, Exus stood up again, slamming his hand on the table as if to shatter it into 100 pieces. Then he strode forward, snatching a sword from another soldier. The blade gleamed under the lights of the room. Exus drew the sword, slowly dragging its edge across the stone floor of the banquet hall, ignoring the guests and Prince Dirk who still sat there, advancing towards the now panicked, portly Viscount. Prince Dirk, wanting to stop Exus, stood up and shouted, "Stop this at once." It was a boisterous and chaotic night. If it were only Exus and the loud-mouthed Viscount, the latter would have been dead long ago, and Exus wouldn't listen to anyone. It was all so dramatic. Prince Dirk was much calmer, but he still hadn't figured out a solution, only knowing how to repeatedly intervene in their recklessness. "I know you enjoy entertainment, but isn't this too much?" Because of the conflict between you and Viscount Silgark. I won't allow you to duel. Exus snapped, even ignoring Prince Dirk. He angered me, and now you want me to calm down? It was unclear if a duel would actually take place, as Exus kept swaying between fury and composure, ultimately taking no action or resolving anything. The food on the table was plentiful, but untouched, likely cold by now. Prince Dirk rubbed his temples, sighing wearily. Oh, this temper. Fine, let the person involved speak. Finally, he noticed the girl at the center of this conflict. Faced with the question of whether Viscount Silgark's claims were true, Deon remained silent, blank, indifferent, expressionless. All the resistance and unwillingness to speak were evident on her face. At this moment, the Viscount seemed to realize something, turning around with a delighted laugh. Ah, there's one thing I didn't mention. That bitch can't speak. The strange thing was, Deon could clearly speak normally. What was the truth? Her hair neatly combed back, standing in the brightly lit room. Deon hadn't uttered a single word, hadn't shown any emotion since her appearance. What had happened to her to make her so stubbornly imprison herself? I know this because I've been with her for 3 years. Exus looked at her in surprise. Impressive. 3 years without speaking or making a sound, like a mute. That stupid bitch. An image of Deon imprisoned in dark shadows, wrapped in massive, sharp barbed wire, flashed through Exus's mind. Perhaps it was his imagination, conjured up by looking at her and listening to Silgark's words. He felt a pang of disappointment in this seemingly strong, stubborn woman who turned out to be a girl with a deeply scarred past. He put his hands on his hips, clicking his tongue in displeasure. He wondered if this woman saw silence as the best protection. Her 3 years of silence must have been a terrifying time for her. From the image of barbed wire tightly wrapped around her, to Deon's face, to Deon, wearily walking through the smoldering ruins of her life, barbed wire binding her legs, the clothes of a slave binding her fate, not allowing her to think for herself, to speak for herself. A pitiful person. The veins on Exus's face bulged again, his suspicion directed entirely at the loud-mouthed Viscount. Was it because of him that his beautiful fairy suffered, imprisoned, unable to do what she wanted, forced away from her home and that terrible past? What happened to her? To make her like this, Exus drew a deep breath, composing himself before he spoke. He knew what he had to do. The Viscount's own words had betrayed him, given Exus the opening he needed to reclaim her. He plunged his sword into the green carpet and said, "It seems Viscount Silgark is mistaken. Clearly, my slave and yours are not the same person." At Exus's words, the Viscount's face flushed crimson. What had he been doing this whole time? Spouting about the past, slandering everyone with rules and contracts. He was taken aback by his own outburst, stunned by Exus's audacious claim. Finally, he collected himself, turning to the beautiful, yet undeniably pained, woman at the center of it all. Exus stood near her, close enough that they could hear each other speak. He was so tall, and she so small. He wanted to protect her, to possess her. He looked at her, a gesture he should have made long ago, from the moment her hair had been painfully pulled to the moment she was insulted and humiliated. Perhaps now he only wanted to possess her, not truly love and understand her. Even so, he had to have her first. Love could come later. Her silence remained terrifying, worrisome, making him wonder why there wasn't an angry defiance or a tearful plea, why there wasn't disgust and rejection. Everything was suppressed behind her icy facade, as if, as he'd said, only when she was feverish and ill did she seem more human. Exus observed her for a moment. She said nothing, but his mind was made up. His plan had to succeed. The Viscount must leave empty-handed, and this woman, no matter what, had to be his. She is a woman who trusts no one. Even at her wit's end, she only wants to be alone. Deon held herself in check. She had cultivated a garden of beautiful flowers, much like her outward appearance, but within her bloomed thorns, dark, terrible, solitary, lonely, only alone. His large, warm hand first caressed her sharp, yet equally cold, face. Their eyes met with an intensity that seemed to create a spotlight of its own, leaving the Viscount standing awkwardly in the distance, grimacing, admitting to himself that for the first time he was being force-fed dog food. The pink of love, the blush of bashfulness, appeared on the haughty lord's cheeks as he was being publicly showered with affection. He, too, was shy because of his own issues. "You're not foolish, are you?" Now, someone's heart is blooming, overflowing with pink and dreamy colors, like someone's budding love. His rough fingers attempted to gently brush away the strands of hair on her face, causing her to react slightly. Then, as if awakened, as if struck by a lightning bolt of love, her face seemed to regain some warmth, her eyes gradually opening, becoming sparkling and warm, her lips pink and vibrant. She decided to speak, to stop the fight between these two men. Whether she was with the Viscount or not, she didn't want this now. Opening her mouth, she softly said, "Yes, my lord, that is correct." Then, our protagonist smiled gently, the most beautiful, relaxed smile of the day. Light bloomed on both their faces, vibrant, as if 100 flowers were blooming and 100 birds were singing. The scene shifted to outside the estate, from a farther, higher angle, where the reader could clearly see the enormous manor, the towering castles standing close together. The party seemed to be over. Everything was over. Deon had changed out of that troublesome dress. Somehow, she was sitting in a humble room with a window, some straw and sticks separating her from the floor below, and a candle beside her. She was back in her slave attire, holding a piece of cloth. A pair of brown-heeled boots walked in soundlessly. She didn't notice them until they appeared before her, and she looked up. The door closed, and a man reminded her, "I told you to rest for the night." But as a lord, he didn't even provide a proper room and bed for her to rest. However, Deon didn't complain. She replied softly, "It was just a pastime." The man in the black shirt with the braided cord at the collar stood with his arms crossed, exasperated, sighing again, frowning. It was the usual expression on Exer's face. "Tell me what happened between you and Silgark, and how you escaped." Despite having gotten her back through a ruse, she had clearly been his slave once, and he was curious about her. He found her sewing, the needle and thread clearly visible in her hands alongside the fabric. Her gaze focused on her task. It turned out that at the party, which had ended just minutes ago, after Dan's ability to speak had been revealed, Viscount Silgark had declared her his slave. The claim had been immediately refuted, but the Viscount wasn't one to back down easily. The image of the Viscount's fleshy face was still fresh in Exer's mind. Dan's slender fingers, still beautiful despite years of servitude, manipulated the needle, creating straight, even stitches. She was opening up to him. "I was sold," she said, her voice quiet. Instead of rushing to comfort her, he asked a second, sharper, more serious question. "What happened to you?" Her hair fell across her face, her eyes glistening with a memory. Alone, the young woman faced her terrible, painful past. "My homeland was at war. My mother found a smuggler's ship to help me escape. Then a storm came, and the ship sank. When I washed ashore, I was captured by pirates and sold to Viscount Silgark. Fate had been cruel, not once but twice, striking her down with fire and sea." Exer scratched his head, picturing the small girl alone on a vast ship. "You sailed alone?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "How old were you?" he pressed. 10. She answered, her voice flat. Seasoned by hardship from such a young age, she had become accustomed to misfortune, continuing to sew even as she spoke. He closed his eyes, a small chuckle escaping his lips. Anyone would be surprised, and then slightly awed. Despite living under her mother's care, she had been forced to become so strong from such a tender age. Images of the past, of that bloody war, began to surface. "So you escaped when you were 13, and then you met Dreyberg, right?" he asked. "Yes, it was in the snow-covered forest," she confirmed. She had left on a cold winter night. Wrapped in a large cloak that dragged on the ground, she had, by some stroke of luck, encountered him. The same gaze and silence, as if Exer had plundered everything. Meeting Dreyberg had been a stroke of fortune for her. None of the other nobles in the vicinity were as kind and generous as he. A man with similar platinum blonde hair to his own, a benevolent face, who held no malice when he encountered Deon, even raising her to where she was now. He was curious as to why such a young girl would flee alone during wartime, but realizing his questions could be answered later through his own investigation and reasoning, and more importantly, that the immediate crisis had passed, he clenched his fist and asked a different question. "Did he hurt you?" His voice was laced with coldness and impatience. He should have been gentler when inquiring about someone's past, not grilling her with a stern face. He was angry, because if this woman hadn't been happy in the past, then the present must be 10 times worse. Didn't he already know that? Yet, as a slave, she didn't ask for much, simply watching him intently as he thought about her, noticing how his words to the corpulent man at the party had been laced with concern for her, worried about whether she had been harmed. Far more mature than her age suggested, she replied, "No injuries, because I abandoned all emotions a long time ago." There was an intimacy between them now, as she opened her heart to him, even forgetting the decorum of their master-servant relationship. He left the doorway and slowly descended the few steps, kneeling on one knee before her. They looked at each other, the distance between their souls shrinking. The room was lit by a single candle. Feeling an unusual warmth, he reached out to touch her, but strangely, she flinched, turning her face away coldly. "Don't touch me," she said. But she had thought too much. He hadn't intended to do anything untoward, merely to gently stroke her hair. Having just heard her story, how could he do such a thing at this moment? Did she think him so base? Then, tilting his head tenderly, he lightly kissed her forehead. This forehead, which, along with its owner, had endured so much. She blushed, seemingly pleased just a moment ago, but for some reason, she still pushed him away, more firmly this time. She grasped his hand, pulling it away, still wanting to avoid him. "Please don't touch me," she pleaded. Though he removed his hand, he said, "I apologize, but this is a little difficult for me." A mischievous smile played on his lips, a glint of longing in his eyes. "You've gone too far now to turn back." Her eyes widened in surprise, her resistance faltering. Her face remained flushed, her lips full and inviting. How could Deon resist? She turned her head away again, but Exer remained intent on closing the distance between them. His eyes, soft and full of longing, fluttered closed. He didn't want to hurt her, to cause her pain, or make her hate him and flee. He only wanted to show her his love. He cupped her face in his hands, his forehead resting against hers, whispering at a terrifyingly close proximity. Perhaps these gentle touches were acceptable, she thought, but she truly didn't want them. He spoke, his voice low. "If you disappear from my sight like an invisible rope binding them together, they would eventually be together, stay together. I might go mad." That's how he felt, the fear of her leaving without a word. Then, in this convenient posture, he placed a deep kiss upon her lips. She closed her eyes, tasting the sweetness and softness. Exer was truly handsome, irresistible to any woman. After the kiss ended, she placed her small hands on his broad shoulders, trying to push him away. "If you don't want me to disappear," she grasped his hands, pulling them away, pushing, removing, but they transformed into the gentlest, most affectionate of touches. Despite this, she initiated contact, firmly setting a condition for him so she wouldn't run away. "Then keep your distance, as I ask." He neither agreed nor disagreed, only smiled faintly and asked with a hint of curiosity, "When were you born?" The sudden question caught her off guard, leaving her speechless. Perhaps it was a long time ago, or perhaps no one had asked her birthday since she was sold by those pirates. Seeing her silence and sadness, he added, "You don't know?" Then she replied, "November 27th, as if affirming that she did remember, and that before the war, she must have spent happy birthdays with her family. She probably hated war immensely, but he was a lord, always destined for battle. Would she hate him? He rose from his knees, standing tall. "All right, I'll remember that day." Looking around the stone room, perhaps because he was so much taller than her, he deemed it too small. Moved to the room next to mine. She felt shy again. Why was he being so kind to her? She wondered if he would abandon her later, how terrifying and painful that would be. Then she hesitantly replied, "I find it comfortable here." He continued to stand, hands on his hips. As a lord, he knew how to persuade this stubborn slave. "They say this winter will be particularly cold. You'll freeze to death without proper blankets." He judged that she wasn't a woman easily swayed, but he had another tactic. "In my past adventures, I've collected various items from all over." He looked back at her, gambling that she would be curious and interested in what he was about to say. "After my travels around the world, I acquired some more items from the East." As expected, she sat up straighter, her heart quickening, interest clearly displayed in her eyes and on her face. Seeing this, Exer grinned at the easily tempted girl. "I think you should organize and display them in the new room." He continued his scheme. "I have to put out some more bait to hook you." He extended his hand to help her up. "Would you like to take them?" Though her age was uncertain, she seemed young, curious, and delighted by the exotic gifts he offered. She was touched, her heart still racing as she looked at him. She reached out, taking his hand, and everything became bright. It was their garden of love, blooming once more. Finally, She did as he asked, letting him pull her to her feet. He was pleased. He looked elegant, seen from behind, with his broad back and shoulders, his long legs. One hand placed behind his back, the other holding hers. All right, I'll build a museum near the annex. Rather than having others attend to it, you can arrange it yourself at any time. A romantic scene, man and woman facing each other, hands clasped as if dancing at a ball. You'll move to your new place after tonight. Oh, what did that phrase mean? Not this room, not the new room. Then where? She was incredibly embarrassed, unable to believe she had agreed from the moment she took his hand. She couldn't change her mind now. He led her away, and she still carried her cloth and sewing tools. She seemed to enjoy this pastime, and he wondered if he had noticed. Furthermore, walking side by side in the encroaching darkness, they looked remarkably well-suited. It would have been a great pity if they hadn't ended up sharing a room. A large window within the room stood open to the wind, letting in a faint light. Inside the room, Cypher bowed his head respectfully. Everything you said is correct, my lord. It turned out that Exer had asked Cypher to observe the situation and report back to him. He sat at his large desk, listening with his chin resting in his hand. Viscount Silgark was said to be lurking near Deon's residence. Yesterday morning, when Exer heard Cypher repeat the Viscount's words, his veins bulged again, murderous intent radiating from him. I must take her to the hunting grounds and bury her alive, so that neither rat nor bird will know. That's what the Viscount had said. Both men were aghast at the Viscount's horrific idea, but Exer's composure, even in the face of such barbarity, earned him Cypher's complete admiration. Indeed, few think like you do, my lord. If you're fast enough, Cypher, still standing at attention with his hands clasped behind his back, continued his report. Though he has neither status nor money, he still holds the king's trust. The lord's fingers drummed against the desk. He wanted to calculate and plan carefully to contend with this man, to defeat him, to protect Deon at all costs. Cypher, though, harbored some resentment towards Exer's favoritism towards Deon. She's just a chef, Exer declared firmly. She will become my woman. Once she catches the eye of the higher nobles, haven't you seen them all staring at her? Cypher, however, believed she wasn't so weak as to need protection. Exer, arms and legs crossed, disagreed with Cypher's assessment. Even if the king isn't weak, he still needs the royal guards. Exer truly knew how to leave others speechless. Leaning back in his chair, Exer's face seemed more peaceful and gentle than ever. No expression, no stare, just a simple face. Even the strong sometimes need protection, he explained. If she might be in danger, it must be planned for carefully. Fine, I'll have 2 soldiers follow her. Just when things seemed settled, Exer suggested, no, assign 2 knights to follow her. The suggestion startled Cypher. Assign knights? He thought. Had his lord truly fallen for this chef? If something like this happens again, I won't let you off the hook, Exer stated. All right, then who? Exer immediately nominated Reynold. This time, Cypher was truly shocked. Had he heard wrong? He couldn't believe his ears. What about Rob? He stammered, suggesting others, but Exer refused. Rob cannot be assigned. He was thinking at that moment that it was best to take this seriously. Perhaps it wasn't just the danger to the slave girl he was infatuated with, but also a threat to his reputation as a slayer of women. To have someone barge in and steal his woman, especially a beautiful one, might be unacceptable to him. Cypher, however, still hesitated. Yes, I understand, but at this point, Exer traced a finger across the page of a book, as if searching for information or simply reading while discussing matters with Cypher, a skill mastered by those in high positions of leadership. He was thinking about Rob, too. Rob has feelings for Deon, right? He recalled something and confirmed it with Cypher. This didn't seem to be a trivial matter, and it was having quite an impact on him. He looked thoughtfully at Cypher and sighed, seemingly not quite satisfied with his soldiers.